Okay, Nathan, I think we should start.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're spanning the globe here. I'd like to welcome you to the third session of the 8th CEPR Economic History Symposium, hosted by CEPR, the Graduate Institute, and the University of Geneva. We have 3 papers this session, and before we start, there's a slight program change. The paper by Nomi Lamoureux and John Wallace, Making Rules Impersonal, which was supposed to be the 3rd paper in this session, is going to be the 1st paper in the 4th session. The paper by Ellison, Lee, and O'Rourke on the end of 30 big depressions is going to be the last paper in this session. So just to let you know, we have the slight program change. And just recapping the housekeeping rules. So presenters have 20 minutes to present the paper uninterrupted. Then we have 10 minutes of Q&A. Panelists, you're welcome, and you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Attendees can put their questions in the Q&A. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to enter your questions, and we'll get to them in the Q&A session. So a few more people are joining in, panelists. Okay, so we'll wait a couple, 30 seconds or so. Yeah. Okay, so the first paper will be presented by Joy Shen from Sheikong Graduate School of Business, and she'll present the paper on state formation and bureaucratization, evidence from pre-imperial China. Joy, you have 20 minutes.
All right, thank you, Nathan. I'll share my screen. Oops. Hi, my name is Joy, and today I'm going to present my work on state formation and bureaucratization evidence from pre-imperial China. So state building has very profound implications for economic development in the sense that centralized bureaucratic states provide public goods, and they enhance the protection of property rights and encourage productive investments by limiting the use of violence. So throughout human history, there are hundreds and thousands of states have been built and destroyed. And out of them, China is a very crucial and important case because it was one of the earliest states to develop a centralized bureaucracy. And those institutions actually persisted in the empire for over 2,000 years. So far, scholars who study the formation of states and the development of state capacity really focus on the importance of warfare. And the leading explanation for state building is that warfare makes states, and that's because war incentivizes rulers to really build up their extractive capacity so they can fully equip themselves to go to war. So in the 7th century BC, China was composed of many autonomous regional states that were ruled by warlords and vassals. And in 221 BC, this is when the first unified empire with a centralized bureaucratic government was founded. So in the context of pre-imperial China, I study how centralized bureaucratic states form. And in particular, I asked the following 2 questions. First, how do military conflicts affect state building? And secondly, what are the underlying mechanisms? And a 1-sentence summary of my finding is that defensive needs drive decentralization, and that offensive military needs drive centralization. And that is because this decentralization, centralization, they can more closely align the interests of the ruler and the local administrator in these scenarios. So this paper speaks to 3 strands of literature. The first one being papers that study the relationship between war and state building. So my contribution would be that I introduced the incomplete contracts framework to study how both rural and local agents' incentives at conflict affect state building. And the second series of literature that this paper speaks to study other determinants of state building, for example, importance of money for military success and number and direction of external threats. And here I show that the type of military conflicts can affect state building. And the third strand of literature that I speak to is state building in pre-imperial China. There aren't many economics paper on this. So I here provide the first quantitative analysis of conflicts in state building in pre-imperial China, and I propose a theory to explain the observed patterns. So firstly, I'll spend 2 or 3 minutes on the background of this period. So the historical era in which this state building political transition really took place can sort of be roughly divided into 3 periods. We can think of the first one is the Western Zhou, which is between 1041 BC to 770 BC. And we can think of the Western Zhou as sort of a starting point, initial condition kind of period. And then comes the spring and autumn period, which is going to be the focus of analysis of this paper. And this is when state building really took off. And in the war, going into the Warring States period, this is where state building intensified and ultimately consummated in the unification in 221 BC. So what was each period like? So in the Western Zhou period, there were sort of more than 100 regional states in central China. And within these regional states, we have rulers and vassals. The rulers of states appoint vassals and give them fiefs. And vassals collect taxes from fiefs, where they use the money to maintain their private armed forces, and they have hereditary office holdings, so they can pass their fiefs to their sons and grandsons and so on. And moving into the spring and autumn period, this is where we see where state building really begins to happen. So rulers of those regional states began to create counties, and counties are really in contrast to fiefs. So counties is where rulers can really centralize and control the resources, and they appoint bureaucrats to manage those counties. So what do bureaucrats do? So bureaucrats, they collect taxes, they submit those taxes to rulers, and they command the county armies under rulers' consent. And then moving into the Warring States period, we have less than 20 regional states left. And among many of the survivors, they've instituted many counties. So this really symbolized really very strong centralized control of domestic resources at the hands of the ruler. And we see sort of full-fledged bureaucracy in several of those regional states. But now I briefly talk about the 2 data sets that I collect to study this question. The first data sets are on counties and fiefs in this period. So for each county and fief, I know its name, year of creation, roughly present day location, who created it, and so on. And the sources come from historian study of historical administrative divisions in China. And the second data set I use are on conflicts. So for each conflict between those states, I know the year, duration, where it happened, who initiated it, and who was a target, and other participants of those wars. And the source comes from the catalog of historical wars, which is a source that most Chinese economic historians use. So let me sort of show a map to help conceptualize what was going on in the period. So this is a map of the regional states of the spring and autumn period. which my analysis focuses on. So most of these states with actual names, they are politically active and they are mostly scattered across central China in the Yellow River Basin. And in this period, there are around sort of 100 active states, but the number starts to decline pretty rapidly. And the ones that are highlighted in red are the four major powers of that period that had, quote unquote, each acquired a sphere of domination. So my then the two states that are boxed both in red and in blue, the Jin and the Shu. So these are the states that I am going to focus on in my empirical analysis. So my main measure of state building in the context of pre-imperial China is the number of counties that are created. So recall that counties are sort of administrative districts where rulers can centralize their controlled resources. So there has been very rapid growth of counties throughout this period. So if we see this graph, the number of new counties created over time has been rapidly increasing, but the number of states that create counties are confined to very few, especially if we think that there have been like 100 states that are politically active. So we really see a divergence in state building. And the major powers are really the guys who are very committed to state building. They built many counties and they were the militarily aggressive guys. And the other states, in comparison, they built very few counties and they were militarily defensive. And we can actually see that those major powers were also tended to locate on the periphery of this map, whereas the other states are sort of gathering in the middle. So now I'll spend a few minutes to talk through the model that I construct to study how military conflicts really affect the ruler's decisions to decentralize versus decentralize. So in this model, I have two players, a ruler and an agent. So the ruler appoints an agent to manage a landed domain D and gives out a fee for accounting contract to that agent. And the agent is endowed with the task of collecting taxes and commanding armies. And then he has an outside option, V. And the timing of this model is one shot, two stages. In stage one, the ruler chooses the contract and the agent collects taxes. And in stage two, this is where conflict transpires. Then so the agent chooses whether to engage or avoid that conflict. And if he engages, he chooses military investment. So the key piece of this model really lies in how I model fiefs and counties. So I'm going to introduce the incomplete contracts framework, where under the fief contract, this is where I say that the agent is the owner of domain D, and under the county contract, this is where the ruler is the owner of domain D. So under the incomplete contracts framework, this concept of ownership entails the residual right of control over resources and contingencies that were not governed by exclusive contracting, including control over human resources. So in my model, this ownership difference, this difference between fief and counties, are really captured by two features. The first is the income. If the vassal, under the fief contract, the vassal owns the fief and he gets all of the taxation income. But under the county contract, the ruler owns the domain, so the bureaucrat collects taxes on his behalf and he gets paid a wage. And the second feature is this control over human resources. Under the fief contract, the ruler, because he's not the owner of the domain, he has no personal control over the vassal. And under the county contract, because the ruler owns the domain, he can remove the bureaucrat at no cost because he has this power to exclude others from using his asset, which is the landed domain deed. So this model really draws two predictions. So I subject my model under two types of military conflict, a defensive one and an offensive one, and I derive two testable predictions, which I'm going to bring to the data. The first prediction is that compared to counties, we're more likely to see fiefs prevail when external military threat is large. And it's very intuitive because if vassals are owners of the domain, then they derive a higher payoff from successfully defending their property, from successfully defending the domain. And therefore, they're more willing to take on stronger enemies. And the second prediction is that compared to vassals, bureaucrats are more willing to attack enemies when war prizes are small. And this is also intuitive because the ruler has personal control over the bureaucrats. So if the bureaucrat says, no, I don't want to go, then the ruler can have costless means of punishing the bureaucrat. Therefore, this personal control really makes the bureaucrat have to be more obedient to what the ruler wants. So firstly, I test my the first prediction using data on fiefs and counties in the two states that I mentioned before, Jin and Chu. So I use this following regression where the outcome variable is equal to 1 if district I in state J is a fief, and 0 if it's a county. And on the right-hand side, the key explanatory variable is this MIJ, which is a proxy for military threat. And there are also controls, state fixed effects, and time dummy. So I used two proxies to proxies to measure the extent of military threat that a particular administrative district is facing. So the first one I use is whether or not this administrative district is on the state border. And we can see that those that are situated on the state border, they are more likely to be a fief. However, this is open to many other interpretations. Then I also use the second measure for military threat, which is the type of neighbor that a district has. So if the district is next to one of the major four powers or nomadic tribes who are known to have this capacity of creating great disruptions, then I say that this district has a strong neighbor. And for any other state that it borders, I'll just then they fall under this category of weak neighbor. So we see that this this result of on border is really sort of driven by districts that are neighboring those strong states and nomadic tribes. So this really shows that this higher military threat induces rulers to decentralize and give more powers and rights to local agents. And secondly, I test the second prediction that counties are more likely to attack enemies when war prizes are small. And to test this result, I use data on attacks by Chu and Jin. And to proxy for war prizes, I used the distance between those attacks to administrative districts to proxy for war prizes. And the idea is that those attacks that are farther must incur higher logistical costs. And that's because, well, you need people to really carry supplies and other provisions to be able to go to war. So wars that are further from your own state means that you have to, like have more people carrying those supplies with you, and thus higher logistical costs. And this will result in smaller net gains overall. So a caveat for my data is that I don't really have info on which districts send armies to which attacks. So to really address this problem, I use two complementary approaches to bring this prediction to data. The first approach that I use is a difference in differences style approach, where here on the left-hand side, the main outcome variable is the number of attacks that are initiated by state J in decade T, and attacks that occur within R miles of its own district. And on the right-hand side, the main explanatory variable is this dummy county IGT. So this is equal to 1 if we see a county administration being present at district I. So so this is a DID style approach. And here I divide those attacks into two groups, one that are within 0 to 50 miles of a district, and the second group is within 51 to 150 miles within a district. So we see that the presence of a county is associated with higher occurrence of those longer range attacks, but not of those lower range lower range attacks. And my second approach tries to address the caveat by assuming that only sort of the nearest districts would dispatch troops to attacks. So I match the attacks to the nearest K active districts of that state. And I run the following regression to test whether counties are associated with attacks that are further away from it. And here I run regressions on K equals 10 and K equals 5. So I'm matching attacks to their nearest 5 districts or nearest 10 districts. And we see that we do see a statistically positive relationship between counties and the attacks. Right, so I think that's about 20 minutes, and I'll just conclude. So my paper asks the question of how military conflicts affect the formation of centralized bureaucratic states. And in the context of pre-imperial China, I use an incomplete contracts framework and data to demonstrate that defensive needs drive decentralization, and that military offenses drive this need for centralization. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Joy. Thank you for perfect timing. So we have 10 minutes for Q&A, and just to recap the housekeeping, panelists can unmute themselves. Attendees should put their questions in the Q&A. So at the moment, I see the Q&A bin is empty, so I'll use my chairman prerogative to ask you a couple of questions. So one of them is related to the endogeneity of all this, to the ability to collect taxes. And there's this relatively recent paper by Meishar, Moav, and Neyman, the American Political Science Review, that looked at the formation of even more ancient empires in the Near East. And there, the argument is that that geography and information asymmetries basically determine the ability to collect taxes, to have bureaucracies, and therefore there's some endogeneity in this, and then you have the conflicts, obviously. So they emerge from the ability to collect taxes. So yeah, that's my question.
So sorry, I do a few robustness checks. So the one of which was the did not link. Okay, so one of which is the monitoring cost, which addresses the information asymmetry question. So I basically re-estimate the equation controlling for their distance to the capital city. and the estimates remain robust. And it's kind of interesting in the sense that like distance to capital is actually negative here. And I think that's because if we look at the map, those states are not very large. For example, Jin is probably the size of modern England-ish. So they're not very big, and monitoring cost wasn't a huge problem for states this size.
Okay, thank you. Steve, you raised your hand.
Yes, I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit about how your analysis works in the imperial period, because I mean, on the face of it, it seems like once you've established a large empire, you become inherently defensive, and yet it remains very centralized. And then you have so the Song dynasty gets sort of invaded by the Mongols, then they reestablish the Ming dynasty, and they're still defensive. They are centralized. So how does that work?
Yeah. So I think in the imperial era, we conceptualize China as being this very centralized empire, but actually within the empire, there are a lot of geographical heterogeneity. For example, say in the Tang Dynasty, a lot of the border districts, they were sort of turned into military towns, where the governors or commanders of these towns have a lot of discretion and power in dictating the use of taxes and things. And Song, that's actually an interesting case, because Song was very highly centralized in the sense that they didn't really have a lot of the military towns in the border area, and they didn't do very well, I'd say. Yeah. So I think we can like sort of look into this this heterogeneity within a centralized empire, and we can like sort of see that, well, in places that are bordering the nomadic tribes and stuff, there tends to be more delegation of power.
So we have a question from Jeremiah. Do you want to unmute yourself? Put a question in the chat. Yeah, so if you're not there, so Felix.
Yeah, so I had a question. So in your paper, you asked in terms of defensive needs leading to decentralization, but the reverse also seems plausible to me in the sense that if you live in a very decentralized environment, then having an army is sort of an important bargaining chip, even if you not intend to use it as defense for your current state formation you're part of. But if you think about switching allegiances, for example, yeah, so the idea was, if there is lots of decentralization, then individual fiefs have a high demand for having control of their own armies. Is that something that might play a role here also?
Sorry, I didn't quite get your question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, sure. So I was just wondering whether the causality could be the other way around, actually. Yeah, so you figure out the causal effect from need for defense to decentralization, but the other way around seems also plausible. Yeah, so if you live in a decentralized environment, then the fiefs or the local rulers, they might have incentive to control of their own military and their own armies, and they build them up in order to have a powerful bargaining chip in whatever allegiance they eventually decide to.
Okay. All right, thank you. So in the historical context that I'm studying, well, for example, those counties and fiefs that I study, like I sort of look at, well, firstly, I look at whether they are counties and fiefs at their time of establishment. So prior to their time of establishment, there was nobody there. So this really captures, I guess, the rulers' thinking that, well, if I want there to be an administrative district, is it better that it's a fief or is it a county? So like they don't sort of bargain with an existing lord at a particular place. They institute a vassal there. So I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think 99%.
Okay.
Okay, so Jeremiah wants me to read the chat. So I'll just read it.
Okay.
And hopefully you can see it too, Joy. So I'll just read it for the audience. So Mark Alvin says, with Fogel's old characterization of China as a hydraulic despotism is incomplete, but not foolish or without perception. How might these aspects of public good provisions and power intersect with A, the military story, and B, contracting framework?
That's a very good question. So I did something that might partially address this question. So like I use the JEZ database to compute the irrigation potential of those districts, and I use them as an additional control in my paper. And yeah, the estimates remain robust. But again, this is only sort of, I guess, the local need for irrigation. Yeah.
Thank you. Tony Moore has a question, so I'll unmute you. Tony, you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I wasn't expecting to be allowed to speak. Yes. No, I thought it was a fascinating paper. My question is, you're kind of looking at the contracting between the ruler and the local administrator, but there's also a further layer of subcontracting by that local administrator with, I assume, important people in the locality to actually gain their support and loyalty in military conflicts. So the question is, and this is, European feudalism, it's maybe cheaper for a fief holder to build those connections than it is for a bureaucrat who's removable by, a cause. So I'm wondering, could you build that into a model in the sense that military investment is either cheaper or more effective for the fief holder than it is for the person in charge of a county, who probably has to kind of spend more resources to get the same level of support as the sort of hereditary, well-placed and strongly locally integrated fief holder?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. I'll definitely think about building that channel into the model. And I think from a historical background perspective, the vassals recruited both their clansmen and local peasants into the army, whereas county bureaucrats, they just recruit peasants. So maybe the way of recruitment are not too different, but it's definitely possible that vassals have a cheaper way of raising an armed force. Thank you for that comment.
Okay, so we have time for one final question. Evo, you want to?
Yes, thanks for the paper. It's very interesting. I was wondering, in this historical or societal context, what constitutes a war prize? So, if these states attack each other, what are they after? Are they looting the other state? Are they placing territorial claims? Are they raiding for slaves? So, what is typically?
So there are.
When you win the war, what do you take?
Sometimes they take land, sometimes they just raid.
And does that involve slave raiding as well? Can you take people from the other state, integrate them within your own state?
Could you slavery? Yes, I think you can take slaves, though I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, so I think we had a very lively 10 minutes of discussion, a little bit more. So we'll thank you again, Joy.
Thank you
for presenting. And we'll move
thank you,
on.
Nathan.
Yeah, okay. So we'll move on to the second paper in the session, the paper by Kivan Karaman and Shevket Pamuk on state capacity in Europe and in other regions since 1500. So Shevket, you're presenting. And again, 20 minutes and followed by Q&A. Please, I'd like to remind you again to put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, if you can, because it's hard for me to keep track of both. Okay, so Shevket, go ahead. Unmute yourself, Shevket. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. I want to make sure you can see my slides. Okay. Okay, now, Joy's paper has done some work already for my introduction, but let me begin by emphasizing that this is joint work with Kıvanç Karaman, and we would both like to thank the organizers for including us in the program. Well, by this time, we all recognize that state capacity has become one of the more discussed concepts in development economics, political economy, and economic history. State capacity refers to the ability of a state to collect taxes, enforce law and order, and provide public goods. This emerging literature emphasizes the role of centralized political institutions in state building and economic development. And of course, as the previous paper has made clear, state building is a long and slow process. There are different dimensions of state capacity: administrative capacity, legal capacity, fiscal capacity. And in the literature, revenue generating capacity is usually accepted as a proxy for state capacity. And this is where our paper comes in. Underlying our paper today is a large data set of estimates of annual revenues of states. And I should say at the outset that our estimates, especially those for the period before 1800, are preliminary. We've taken some shortcuts with the available data, and rather than discuss the technical details of our estimates, I want to focus on the big picture in this short presentation. In this first pass, we would like to provide a comparative overview of the European and the developing country pattern since 1500. We would also like to raise some questions for the literature on state capacity and for debates in economic history. Just a few comments on alternative measures of state capacity. You find in the literature that some people employ tax revenues per capita as a measure of state capacity. The problem with that is that rather than a large part of this measure then ends up focusing on the level of income or the level of GDP per capita. In many of the papers, studies on early modern era, tax revenues per capita has been deflated by the daily urban wage, for which we have a good deal of data across Eurasia and also the Americas. Now, in order to provide a uniform measure, both for the early modern and the modern era, and also deflate tax revenues per capita with some measure of income or GDP, we attempt in this paper to use tax revenues divided by GDP as the measure. And then we've developed these estimates for all the countries and the periods, well, for which medicine estimates are medicine and post-medicine estimates are available for GDP per capita. Another wrinkle, we use revenues of the central government or central administration until 1800, and then we use total tax revenues, that is including revenues of local governments for the period after 1800. So this is just the big picture. The black line shows the rise of T over GDP for Western European states. The black line is the Western European averages, say roughly for the 6 Western European states. Okay, and you can see that the rise in T over GDP ratio begins early, begins basically 17th century, 16th, 17th century. And of course, some inflection points, such as, well, early modern era, but also Keynesian revolution and so on. And you can see that for the second unbroken line is for, the blue line is for middle and high income developing countries, middle and high income today. And there is a parallel movement, but distinctly lower. And then for comparison, I chose a basket of weaker developing country states today. And of course, most of them did not exist before the 19th century, even in most parts of the 19th century. So you see this broken line shows the rise, the more modest rise of T over GDP in the 20th century for these other developing country states. Now, I thought this ratio does not fully reflect, of course, state capacity, the differences in state capacity, because at any given point in time, the developed countries have the Western European countries have higher GDP per capita. Just to see how the developing countries have been doing since 1500, or since more recently, since 18th century. Well, and with respect to GDP per capita, I tried to draw on this graph for the first time the T over GDP ratios of both Western European countries and today's medium and high income developing countries. T over GDP on the vertical axis, and the natural log of GDP per capita in 2011 prices, the most recent medicine estimates. Well, to my surprise, at least to my surprise, these two graphs look broadly similar. They seem to suggest that at least not all the developing countries, but at least the medium and high income developing countries appear to have T over GDP ratios similar to Western European countries for a given level of GDP per capita. So these two paths of the Western European countries and developing countries may seem similar. However, we're going to argue in this paper that in developing countries, state capacity was built and continued to be built under very different circumstances, and that this capacity was built often in interaction with European states. So again, our argument, and by implication, we would like to argue at the very end that if we want to understand development of state capacity in today's developing countries, obviously some dimensions of European experience, Western European experience, is relevant and important. But we would like to argue that their histories, the histories and institutions of these two groups of countries have been very different. So not all aspects of Western European experience are relevant. On to the European pattern. So in what follows, I will go over very quickly the two patterns based our early for European, Western European and European countries, our patterns based on our joint paper with Kıvanç. You can see the rise of T over GDP in the early period, as early as 16th, 17th century. And of course, Netherlands sticks out, but it turns out that one of the big reasons that Netherlands was able to collect a lot more than others was that Netherlands' GDP per capita was distinctly higher than other countries in the early modern era, for most of the early modern era. 19th century, if you look in per capita terms, the gap between Western Europe and other regions of Europe continue to increase in the 19th century. But if you adopt T over GDP as the measure of state capacity, there is a catch-up where some of the leading Western European countries, including Netherlands, the UK, experience decline in the T over GDP ratio, but there is catch-up by the others. Other parts, Prussia, Central European countries. Now, fiscal centralization is experienced before 1800. Interstate competition, as Joy has also argued, interstate competition, warfare is common to all European countries. But we want to emphasize that in Europe, you see a variety of experiences and different paths to the rise of state capacity. Obviously, geography, urbanization, money use, all matter. And we also observe that Western European countries are more urban economies, more capital intensive, and Central and Eastern European economies more agrarian. And there is this emphasis in the literature on the representative regime as the key to rising state capacity, but we find that for agrarian economies, less representative or more authoritarian regimes in Europe, like Austria-Hungary, Russia, Prussia, were able to also raise revenue. And this has implications for present-day developing countries, we would argue. Okay? And this is the pattern for 20th century. Now, on to the developing countries, the striking conclusion, finding coming out of recent literature is that this tax over GDP ratio has remained below 5% in the early modern era for countries for which we are able to find data. Mughal India, Ottomans, China, Japan. Again, tax revenues of central administrations. The only exception is colonial Mexico in the second half of the 18th century. And that's also a very telling exception in the sense that this was based on a commodity boom, on silver boom. And we find that with the fading of the silver boom in the 19th century, this ratio T over GDP declines once again below 5% in the 19th century. Here are developing country T over GDP ratios in the 19th and 20th century. these are, again, not all developing countries. These are the medium and high income developing countries, the countries which are doing better. We argue in the literature, we argue in the paper that in the earlier period, there is external conflict, but not to the same degree as in Europe and not with the same effect. There is a good deal of political fragmentation, and a large share of tax revenues are retained by local elites, and share of central administration typically remain low. There was this mention earlier on to powerful despotic states. This evidence is not consistent with powerful hydraulic states. So I think at the very least we need to explore. For China, it may be the earlier period where perhaps in the earlier period, central administrations had a higher share of the tax revenue, but not for the early modern era. And one implication coming out of this early modern picture is for the debate on great divergence. We find that there is, in one important respect, in terms of this T over GDP ratio, Western European states and non-European states differ. And there is also evidence that low state capacity for these non-European states hurt economic development in terms of monetary unification, coinage, budgets, and so on. And of course, these states had a difficult time standing up to European powers in the 19th century. Nathan, how many minutes do I have?
3.
3, okay. Now, I want to focus on the contrast between the European experience and the developing country experience, not only on the early modern era, but also in the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the contrasts, I think, the conclusions coming out is that in the past of today's developing countries is not only the colonial experience, and the recent literature on the colonial state has focused on the emergence of state building in the colonial era, but equally important is the experience of non-European states that were able to stay independent in the 19th and 20th century. And we want to emphasize that the European challenge, the rise of powerful states in Europe, created intense pressures for political centralization and rise in state capacity for the non-European states. Well, we know the examples of Japan, China, but also Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and even in Europe, Russia. These are very prominent examples of the European challenge creating pressures for modernization. Obviously, the responses varied, different paths were chosen, but in a number of cases, the European challenge, the presence of powerful European states led to growing centralization and growing authoritarianism in the 19th century. So in that sense, interstate competition had implications not only in Europe, but beyond Europe. And we see the same contrast in the 19th and 20th century. We want to argue that the...
Şevket, you want to wrap up?
Okay. So, again, I will conclude then with the emphasis on the contrast between the two histories. The European history and path to state capacity and the developing countries' path to state capacity has been very different. And if we want to take history and institutions matter, if we take history and institutions seriously, then I think we need to be careful about taking the European experience as the basis for studying today's developing countries and how they raise their state capacity. Okay, I leave you with this summary graph.
Okay, thank you, Shevket, for an interesting presentation. And so I'll open the floor for questions. Again, you can ask in the Q&A and also raise your hand if you're a panelist. So again, let me kick us off by asking, trying to, it's more of a comment. It reminds me of the recent work by Branko Milanovic on inequality, where sort of the ability to tax or to redistribute is a function of GDP or GDP per capita. And the higher the GDP per capita, the more potential there is for in his case, redistribution, but in your case, it's taxation. And therefore, I found it interesting when you plot the when you scale things by GDP per capita, the paths look similar, and that's something which is again reminiscent of Milanovic's work. But then there are these issues of endogeneity, of whether state capacity, earlier state capacity leads to higher GDP per capita or vice versa. So yeah, if you want to relate to that, if not, it's just a comment.
I agree with you that this earlier graph on this one, okay, they appear to be
this one.
similar. There is that they appear to be on this more or less the same path. However, we want to argue that the structures, the history, institutional, and social structures in the developing countries today are very, very different. The developing countries experienced the 19th century as really exporters of primary products, so giving rise to the political rise of agrarian elites, mercantilist elites, and so on. And in that sense, what appears to be similar in this graph, we argue, is actually hiding a good deal of differentiation.
Yeah, that's obviously true. Juan, you wanted to, can I mute yourself?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Shevket, for this very interesting presentation. I have a question regarding the colonial, post-colonial regimes and the fact that in some cases there is some continuity in state capacity, but not in others, right? And you showed the case of colonial Mexico. And you know, this as you said, this is pretty much driven by this silver production boom. But what remained thereafter was almost nothing, right? So everything had to be rebuilt at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's a clear rupture and a clear cut. And so, I mean, it's a completely different story that's going to be built thereafter. And I think what you see in the post-colonial periods during the 20th century, I think there is something completely different, right? So it's a completely different story. And I wonder whether, you know, regarding all this literature on colonial heritage, whether you could say something regarding this, you know, different trajectories also within developing countries.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the literature on state building, EWOUT is part of this literature. State building in colonies emphasizes, if I'm not mistaken, emphasizes continuities between the colonial period and the independence period. And I would say that these continuities are important in one respect, that this integration in, whether it's in the 18th century, 19th century, to the global economy as producers of primary products, strengthen the agrarian elites, the mercantilist, the commercial elites, And I would say this is some aspect common to whether these countries have a colonial past or not. So in that respect, I see a commonality, whether they have a colonial experience or not.
Thank you. Move on to Ewout.
Yes, thanks, Sefket, for this paper. It's very interesting. I think if we talk about developing countries in the context of colonial settings, there is another aspect of state capacity that matters, and that may actually downplay even the measures of tax revenue over GDP, and that is the issue of forced labor, right? So in a lot of colonial states, not only in Africa, but also in Asia, there's states make use of forced labor on a large scale. And Marloes van Wijnberg, for instance, has argued that you should count that as implicit forms of tax revenue as well. And her argument is that forced labor is being used for all sorts of state development programs, and it is also clearly an aspect of state capacity if you can amass all that labor, but you get it supplied at a below market rate, right? So you basically, this is tribute labor, free labor that you do not compensate, or only at a very low level compensate. So I wonder, what is your take? Do we think about this as an additional aspect of state capacity, large-scale use of forced labor? Because if we're talking about continuities and discontinuities in developing countries that have a colonial past, this clearly is a discontinuity, right? At some point, that forced labor is phased out, and then it is, everything what you see is in the tax system.
Yes, I think in some ways your question relates to the previous one by Juan. I am more inclined to think not only in terms of how much it adds, how much forced labor adds to the tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, but I am more interested also in the kinds of structural changes in the longer term, or the more dynamic implications of this forced labor, right? It's just not only an issue of arithmetic, but what are the implications for the later period? And yes, I think we should add this, but then again, also important is the legacy for the present era, for the independence era. Is there a legacy? What is the legacy from the forced labor era? I think those are if we're going to, I'm arguing that the structures, the institutions are different. The political coalitions necessary for tax collection are inevitably different. So how does this pass with the forced labor come in to influence, to shape institutions today, political coalitions today, and so on?
Steve?
Just a quick footnote really about the graph you have here. There was a large literature on this in the 1980s in the context of European development patterns, Nick Crafts and Leandro Pradas-Escazura. Essentially, it's the Chenery-Serquin approach. It was developed in development economics. So Nick Crafts applied it to Europe and worked out the European development norm. And I think it's useful because he also looked at individual countries' deviations from the European average, so that it still allows a role for institutions and so on, but it's also kind of normalizing for the level of development. So I think if you have a look at that literature, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I am. Yes, we recognize very much that this is the average, and there's a good deal of variation, obviously, yes, around the average, and that also providing a lot of insights. And of course, part of it is geography, part of it is many other things. And
I think it would be very helpful if you had the third line here for the lower income as well? I mean, did that bring
yes,
them closer to the average? Or?
yes, that the third line is probably going to be distinctly lower. The third line is going to be lower. The broken blue line is going to be below these two. And I should have put that, but it's going to be different than these two.
Yeah, I mean, it'd certainly be useful to see the difference between China and India versus Western Europe. In terms of the great divergence debate, do they differ in terms of this tax revenue per head? And if so, how much?
Okay, so a little bit over time, but maybe one question from the attendees. So I'll try to unmute Tamash. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Shefkat, this is very interesting. So let me try to push you a little bit on the measure. So, I mean, the literature has used this measure of tax revenue relative to the size of the economy, but I'm worried a little about how good enough a measure this is when we compare both countries and over a very long period of time, right? So we don't know what these states actually spent their tax revenue on. If we argue that pre-industrial states spend their taxes on warfare, then we are back to this old debate whether this is a measure of state capacity or a drain on economic resources, right? And I guess the extent to which the taxes were spent on warfare or on genuine public goods provisions must have differed between these regions, but also must have changed dramatically over time. Thank you.
I agree. And I think this is just, as I emphasized earlier on, this is just a first pass, and admittedly a simple first pass, but I hope it raises some questions for later research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Shefkat, for the presentation, and thank you all for lively Q&A. So we move to the final and third paper in this session. And just to remind you, we had a slight program change. So we'll have Kevin Rourke present his paper on the end of 30 Big Depressions, joint with Martin Ellison and Sang-Sung Lee. So Kevin, the floor is yours. 20 minutes.
Thanks very much. Okay, let me see if I can find my, where is it? Right. Oh, okay. Sorry, one sec. I've switched offices. That's why I need to just do a system preference thing here. Okay.
So I think we lost Kevin. So,
oh gosh.
Oh, here he's back. Unmute yourself, Kevin.
Don't ever update your Mac OS before a conference or everything goes to hell. Okay, so I hope this will work now. Where are we? Here we are. Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, we can see.
Great. Okay, super. So this is moving away from short-run institutional or long-run institutional economic history to short-run macro. I should say this is joint with somebody else in Turkey, Sang-Sung Lee, who's in Bilkent, and Martin Ellison, who's in Oxford. So this is a well-known picture. I guess we've often shown this, many of us, to our students. I think that many of us even agree with the implicit message here, which is that leaving the gold standard had something to do with getting out of the Great Depression. And then the question is why? at the time, many observers thought that this was all a beggar thy neighbor type of story. You devalued and you stole a competitive march on your neighbors. Or it could be that by escaping the trilemma, you were able to cut nominal interest rates. Or it could be that you unburdened yourself of the gold standard mentalité and did a bit of Keynesian fiscal expansion. Or it could be something else. And in particular, maybe it had to do with inflationary expectations, which is a story that goes back to Temin and Wigmore. What we do in this paper is we construct a new data set for 30 countries with lots and lots of variables, monthly and quarterly frequency. We estimate inflationary expectations the same way that you would do if you were in a modern central bank. We use exactly the same methods as they do. And then we see how these inflationary expectations adjust as new data becomes available in real time, as it were. So what we're doing is we're sort of pretending that we're a central bank confronted with new data coming in the early 1930s, and we see how inflationary expectations adjusted. And what we find is that leaving the gold standard increased inflationary expectations, lowered real interest rates, and you can see why that might have mattered for recovery. In a way, if you want to put this into a larger narrative, you would go back to Tom Sargent's famous paper on the end of hyperinflations, which we're obviously referencing in our title. So for him, the way that you got off of ended hyperinflation was by changing inflationary expectations durably, and the way that you did that was by going onto gold. Well, we argued that going off of gold was necessary to replace expectations of deflation with stable or inflationary prices. This argument was made by Temin and Wigmore. It was also made by Christy Romer, who used single equation methods to estimate inflationary expectations. People like Gauti Eggertson have incorporated the mechanism into a DSGE model, and there are some recent papers there that argue the same thing using narrative evidence. So we're by no means the first people to have made this argument. There's also a whole bunch of papers that I won't go into that are interested in the question of whether deflation was expected or not at the start of the Great Depression. So people have looked at inflationary expectations or deflationary expectations during this period, but most of them weren't focused. Most of these papers weren't focused on the recovery, which is what we're interested in. We think that we are advancing the literature. We have much more data for many more countries. We're not just looking at one country, we're looking at 30 countries. We're using these modern nowcasting methods that central banks use today. So that's our contribution. The closest paper to ours is this paper by Daniel and Stieg, where they do essentially what we do for Germany. And I think that our results are not incompatible with theirs. Another paper that's very close to ours is this paper by Thilo Albers, who independently from us collected more or less the same data. We have more than he does, but it basically the same sorts of data sources. And he used those data to construct monthly indices of economic activity. We're doing something different. All right. The data sources that we used are the same that Thilo used. I mean, we started collecting these when I got the CRC grant way back when. I wasn't even in Oxford at that stage. So there are these two wonderful interwar compendia of economic statistics, one put out by the Germans and the other put out by an independent organization. So we have data on prices, on quantities, aggregate, industry specific, do with trade data, price data, labor market conditions, financial data, all sorts of things at monthly and quarterly frequency for a long period of time. Oops. We complement that with data from the Federal Reserve Bulletin, the MBR Macro History database that you're all familiar with, the Statistical Yearbook of the League of Nations, and in some cases individual statistical abstracts, and that allows us to do lots of cross checks and so on. Because of what we're interested in, we need to pay particular attention to the nominal interest rate and the price index. So we prefer 6 to 3 month market interest rates and use those wherever possible. We use central bank discount rates. Otherwise, we prefer wholesale price indices wherever possible. We make do with the consumer price index. or even the price of a key commodity, if that's all that's available. We prefer total production indices wherever possible. Sometimes we have to use quantities of key commodities produced. Okay. Very briefly, in terms of the methodology, because time is limited, we're interested in the real interest rate, which depends on inflationary expectations, which is what we're really interested in. We observe nominal interest rates, but we have to estimate inflationary expectations. So basically what they do today nowadays in the central bank is, they have lots of data. They really do have big data nowadays. We have big data by economic history standards, very, very small data, I suppose, if we were a modern central bank. So what they do is they have all of these data coming in at various frequencies, and they relate these data on, the price of wheat or the quantity of freight shipped by rail or whatever it is. These variables are all related to a small set of latent factors that are supposed to be driving everything. And one of these latent factors then represents inflation, which is what we're interested in. And you estimate this system, and then the data comes in and you update and so on. Crucially, this method allows you to handle data with different sample lengths, because that's true of data. It comes in different sample lengths, different publication delays, because of course that's true too. Some data are published more or less instantaneously. Some are reported with lag, with missing observations. Well, you can see why all of these things might be useful if you're working with historical data, because you have these issues cropping up with historical data. Also, we estimate our model using pre-depression data, and then we update the estimate of inflationary expectations as new data become available. In January 1932, various data become available, and then you see how inflationary expectations adjust. And you do this, by the way, for each of our 30 countries. We estimate one of these systems for each of our 30 countries. They're separate models. Now, you need to know when the data becomes available, and so you need to know what the publication delay is. And here we basically look at the American sources, and we see when the data become available. So production data are published with a lag of 3 months. Financial prices become available more or less instantaneously, that sort of thing. And we sort of assume that this delay structure applies to all of our countries. So there's an assumption there. So here's our American data, and here are our estimates of our 4 latent factors, with the global factor representing inflation. And here's, for example, the estimate of year-on-year inflation in March 1934. This is what you predicted year-on-year inflation in March 34 would be. This is the prediction in September 1931. So in September 1931, you're extrapolating forwards, and you were saying, yeah, prices are going to be falling, So you're expecting deflation to be continuing for a long, long time, and you're expecting deflation. And then March, April, May 33 should seem familiar to you if you know your history of the period. And then you can see that they start to turn around. And well, by the end of 1933, they turn positive. And of course, when you're in March 34, you're accurately predicting what is happening in March 34. So you can do this for all of our countries. Now, we want to relate these inflation expectations to departures from the gold standard. That turns out to be trickier than you might think. And if you look at some of these standard sources, they often disagree amongst themselves, in fact, which you might think is odd. To be fully on the gold standard, you need to have a domestic monetary rule pegging your currency to gold, number one. And number two, you need no exchange controls. And if you put 1 and 2 together, then you end up with fixed exchange rates. So you leave the gold standard if you suspend convertibility of your domestic currency into gold. That's clearly leaving the gold standard. You leave the gold standard also if you impose exchange controls. And thirdly, you leave the gold standard if you devalue against gold, or devalue against other currencies. So there are 3 possible ways in which you might leave the gold standard. The question for our purposes is, what might constitute a regime change sufficient to change inflationary expectations? And we wonder whether, and maybe we're going to show you some evidence that suggests that we're right to wonder whether imposing exchange controls has the same effect on inflationary expectations as outright suspending convertibility. I mean, sometimes countries imposed exchange controls so that they would not lose gold, so that they could continue to peg to gold. But by standard definitions, if you impose exchange controls, you've gone off gold. But would you really expect that to have the same effect on inflation expectations as suspending convertibility? Well, we'll talk about that. I mean, here's a long quote from Borchardt talking about Germany. Germany imposes exchange controls in July 31. So many authors quite logically say, well, this is when they go off gold, and indeed so they did. But on the other hand, at the time, contemporaries continue to debate the question of whether or not Germany should go off gold. Well, maybe inflationary expectations then didn't adjust in July 31 in Germany the way that they might have done in, say, Britain in September 31, when Britain very clearly does go off gold. This is something that we can think about and investigate. We managed to, we divided our group up into 4 countries. For 15 of our 30 countries, we can pretty well unambiguously measure the day they go off, the time they won't go off gold. It's very clear, There are 4 countries where they impose capital controls, but never formally leave the gold standard. There are 5 countries where they impose capital controls and then at a later date, unambiguously leave the gold standard, including the United States, where there's a lag of 1 month only between these 2 events. And then there's a few countries where actually it's kind of ambiguous. There's Argentina that leaves the gold standard twice, for example. And so, it's going to be messier looking at these countries. Australia, for example, is one example. They had the private banks managing the exchange rate. There's then legislation brought in late 29, allowing the Commonwealth Bank and the government to expropriate banks' gold reserves. So the League thinks that they've gone off gold. They exercise that right to expropriate gold the month later. So some authors say that's when they go off gold. There's a little bit of a decline in the exchange rate between the Australian pound and gold at that stage. But there's a big slide in the exchange rate against sterling a year later in January 31. At that stage, the Economist thinks they've gone back to a more sensible exchange rate. The month later, there's the Premier of New South Wales saying we really ought to leave the gold standard. So you can see where the ambiguity comes from. They then remain pegged at that lower rate against sterling for the greater part of the year, but then sterling itself leaves gold in September 31. If you look at the big shifts in the value of the Australian pound relative to gold, it's in January and September of 31. So there are these kind of difficult to categorize cases, and I'll skip that. If you look at the unambiguous cases, the Temin-Wigmore argument holds up pretty well. So the red dotted lines are our estimates of inflationary expectations. The blue are our estimates of real interest rates. And, here we have, for example, the Dutch East Indies right at the end of the period. They leave gold. Finally, inflationary expectations go up. Real interest rates go down. It's right at the end of the period. So maybe, you might doubt that evidence. But here's Finland. You can see it much more neatly. That's a very nice case. Here's Denmark, Canada. We couldn't do it for real. Do it for the real interest rate for reasons that escaping me. We didn't have the nominal interest rate. Well, I don't think there was some reason why we couldn't do it for Canada. Here's British India. It's not a turning point as it is for some of these cases, but the inflationary expectations do continue to go up. You can eyeball them. Japan is not a turning point, but afterwards it's continuing to go up. There's the Netherlands, like its colony. There's New Zealand, South Africa, Peru. It looks pretty good, basically. It looks pretty good. Interestingly, the inflation expectations are very volatile for England right at the start. And there's something similar for France. That's interesting. And I don't really have a story for that, except that England was one of the first countries to go off gold, and maybe there was more uncertainty about what the consequences would be. You could make up stories, but I'm really just making up stories. So for our Group A countries where you clearly know where they go off gold, the story holds up pretty well. There are the countries then that impose capital controls, and you don't see these turning points in the way that you did in the previous graph, except possibly in the case of Lithuania. In Germany, yes, it's true, inflationary expectations, well, actually, they move in the wrong direction. after they imposed capital controls. I think this is kind of consistent with some of the work that Michener and Wanschneider and others have done. If anything, it looks like, you know, the turning point is January 33, which, you know, is a well-known date for a completely different reason. I mean, Hitler was very opposed to the gold standard. And even though they nominally retained the link, it looks like inflation expectations do go up in that month. You know, it's not clear that much is going on in either Hungary or Bulgaria. So it's not clear to us that going off gold by imposing exchange controls had the same effect as suspending convertibility. And then there are the cases where they go off gold and then suspend convertibility. Again, it's not clear that you're getting the same clean effects as with the Group A countries. We speculate in the paper that maybe going off gold is kind of blurring the signals that the market is receiving in some way, but we're not really sure how to think about this. And then there are the cases where it's genuinely ambiguous, and we are tempted to use this evidence to talk about, well, when did countries really go off gold in the eyes of the market? So there was a couple of candidate dates for Argentina, and it seems clear that, you know, this one kind of works pretty well. This one works pretty well for Austria. You know, so one thing one could do is one could use these inflationary expectations estimates to talk about when markets really perceived regime change in some of these countries. I'll get back to that. For our unambiguous cases, you can look at by how much did real interest rates fall between when they go off gold and the subsequent real interest rate trough. And the answer is by a lot. And you can decompose that decline in interest rates to the bit due to nominal interest rates and the bit due to inflationary expectations. And it's pretty clear what's dominant. It's inflationary expectations that are doing the work. And you can, of course, also look and see what happened to, you know, real output or trade in the wake of going off gold. And, you know, it's going off gold a lot. But that's just the Eichengreen-Sachs stylized fact. You know, what we're really doing is adding this inflationary expectations mechanism into the mix. We do think a little bit about causality. We look at, for example, the reduction in the real interest rate and its relationship, so this is actually not the reduction, it's the level of the real interest rate or the increase in the real interest rate. And we're correlating that to the strength of the exchange rate. So it's a Bernanke-Carey type of, you know, bivariate regression. And we're just instrumenting for the exchange rate by looking at experience in the 1920s, you know, following up on a suggestion of Barry Eichengreen that Kirsten Wanschneider also checked out in a paper of hers, you know, so instrumenting the strength of the exchange rate in the 1930s by, you know, the extent to which inflation and interest rates changed after they went back on gold in the 20s. And yeah, we're getting the right result. Stronger interest rates are associated with greater increases, lower reductions in the real interest rate. We try synthetic control methods also, if you like that kind of thing. We were able to do this satisfactorily for 5 of our countries. And so here's, you know, what actually happened to the real interest rate in Finland. That's what would have happened in synthetic control Finland. And you can see there's a big difference, right? So synthetic control methods, if you buy that, suggest that there's some causality going on as well. So I'm just about out of time, just sort of summarizing and to tell you where we're going with this in the future. You know, half of our 30 countries unambiguously left the gold standard on clearly defined dates. And for those countries, there's, I think, really strong evidence for the Sargent, Temin, Wigmore hypothesis. I mean, in many of these countries, there's actually a turning point in the data. Inflation expectations had been declining, and then they start to rise. In the other cases, you know, they had been rising and they continue to rise. You know, there could, of course, be other factors pushing up in inflationary expectations independently of leaving the gold standard. But in none of those countries do inflationary expectations fail to rise after they leave gold. So that's pretty strong, we think. For the countries where the timing of departure is unclear, arguably we can, you know, use our results to help us see what really mattered in terms of turning around expectations. But then that raises a paper writing rhetorical question for us. If we're targeting this paper at economists, where you want the causality and the message, you know, the causality be sharp and the message simple, you know, you might want to maybe just focus on those 15 countries. You know, on the other hand, you know, I mean, as economic historians, we find ourselves drawn to the complexity of this. And so, you know, we're never sure amongst ourselves, do we keep this all in one paper? Do we split it up in two? I mean, who knows? I don't know what you guys think about that. I think that we may add more data, you know, maybe, you know, one of the things that we can do is, I mean, by the way, the data are all available on the CEPR's website. But, you know, if this is going to become a go-to place to get monthly and quarterly frequency data for the interwar period, maybe we should continue to try to hoover up as much as we can. So that's something we're thinking about. And finally, Sang is developing a DSGE model with regime switching that, you know, we can use going forward as well. So there are various directions in which this paper could go, and we are, you know, all ears as regards your suggestions. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for a great presentation and keeping to time. So let's start with the Q&A session. So Tobias, you had your hand first, so go ahead.
Thanks very much. It's a great paper. Of course, I would like to see more complexity. Not an economist. No, just one.
But yeah.
One suggestion, maybe you could look in some cases at fiscal turning points. Of course, Germany, when reparation payments were completely suspended in the summer of '32, maybe that's an interesting turning point. Or France, the election of the Popular Front, because I think people at the time knew that fiscal and monetary policy were related, and they were for the gold standard because they knew you have some fiscal discipline. And as soon as people can observe that fiscal discipline is loosening, they may start to change their expectations.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, I think we could potentially do that. Yeah, and I think there are the data there, aren't there? So maybe not at the monthly frequency though, but we could do something looser on the annual frequency.
Yeah, or you could look at newspapers or something like that.
You think about it, yeah. In other words, going off goal could have mattered through changing inflation expectations, but it could also clearly have mattered through other channels as well, you know. And I mean, absolutely, yeah.
Then you have another chronology.
Yeah, but then you're asking us to add new mechanisms to a paper that with different types of countries, so you're complexifying the paper even more.
Yeah, but maybe not just for Group B or for single countries, you know, maybe not for the whole thing.
Yeah.
Felix?
Many thanks for that very interesting presentations. I had one thought about the nowcasting methodology you're using. I thought that's maybe a bit of a strong assumption to impose on contemporaries back then. Isn't it more appropriate to use sort of the methods they would have at their hands back then and the data they would have at their hands back then in order to make predictions?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, it's a sort of question that Mark Flandro would ask. I always think that was a Flandro type question. So yeah, it's a reasonable question. On the other hand, I mean, I don't think the central bankers think that they are defining inflationary expectations. I think that they think that they are measuring the expectations that people out there have as they watch the data coming in through whatever channels they have. And I mean, we are using the data that the people had, you know, so we're only using the data that they had coming in. So that, I guess, would be the defense that we would make, in a sort of loose sort of way. Yeah, I mean, I suppose you might want to try to validate. I mean, I validate it. We could, for example, look at these papers that use narrative techniques and ask whether our, you know, which I guess must be looking at newspaper reports and that kind of thing, and look and see whether our nowcasting methods are matching what they are coming up with, and that would be interesting potentially.
Exactly, I think you're comparing it to.
Might be interesting, yeah. But yeah, but that's the sort of referee comment that you get if you put it into an economic history journal. Yeah.
Steve?
I was interested in the volatility in the UK case. I didn't see it for very long, but I was wondering if that had anything to do with expectations of the price level rather than the inflation rate. Because if you think the price level is is going to stay constant, which I think in interwar Britain would have been a reasonable assumption, then if it goes up 1 year, you should be expecting it to come down the following period. Or I mean, there's, if you look at what people in the Bank of England and the Treasury were aiming for when they came off gold, was to get the price level back to the 1929 level, not to sort of generate inflation. I was just wondering if that might have something to do with it, and maybe have implications. Maybe there's some other economies like that.
Well, so I don't think Sang and Martin have the ability to speak. But one thing that I struck me looking at these slides before speaking today is I think it's very volatile in Britain, and if I'm not mistaken, there's also a lot of volatility in Germany after they impose exchange controls, and there's a lot of volatility, I think, in France before just around when they go off. So they're three biggish countries, whereas in the smaller countries it seems to be cleaner, and I don't know if that's a hint at all that one could follow up. I mean, and maybe it does have something to do with endogeneity of policy targets or something like that. Maybe the others are accepting international prices more or something. I don't know. I'm thinking aloud. But I find that very interesting. You know, so either it's got something to do with the structure of the countries, or it's just that, you know, Britain was an early mover, but then that's not explaining the French thing. So, no, but thanks, Steve. Think about that.
So I'll take one question now from the attendees. So we have a Rafat in the Q&A. So let's see if I can. I'll unmute you, Rafat, and you can ask your question.
Okay. So mine, rather than a question, was a comment, which is you showed that in the, you know, when dealing with the Great Depression, trying to reflate, so to speak, the big kick was coming from expected inflation. And there is recent work that suggests that it works in the other direction too. In particular, the work of Hazel et al. Shows that in the Volcker disinflation, the big kick was also coming from expected inflation rather than changing the immediate demand conditions. So that seems to be symmetric. And in your DSG model, it will be interesting to see what kind of a Phillips curve you will be estimating. And the chances are that you will find that at the time, in the 30s, the Phillips curve was rather flat as well. And most of the kick was coming from the Phillips curve itself shifting around rather than moving along the curve.
Okay, thank you very much for that suggestion. And you're just down the corner from Sam, who is doing the DSG modeling, so that's very convenient also.
Roy, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks for the presentation. I keep on liking the paper, but you ask us for suggestions. So maybe a suggestion would be for the mechanisms, right? There's this old debate on how exactly the monetary flexibility reflected into the recovery. Was it through the labor market, through the releasing credit constraints? Was it through the financial sector? So are you aiming to move in that direction? You know, was it real wages? Was it real interest rates? Was it the credit mechanism?
I mean, I guess that my kind of prior is just, I mean, I'm sort of influenced by Romer's paper, you know, and she just says, look, it's, you know, when you have inflation expectations rise and real interest rates fall, then interest rate sensitive expenditure increases, you know, and she shows that for the States, you know, she finds that, you know, investment expenditure and durables really responds very dramatically when real interest rates fall. So in the back of my head, that's what's going on, but maybe we should check that actually, and we might even have the data to do that.
Exactly.
For our various countries, and that would be another useful thing that we could do, but it would of course make the paper even more complicated. But yeah, I agree. I mean, in a sense, that would be the most the most directly connected to the, you know, what I think we have in our minds.
Well, thank you. So I'll just throw in one comment. I'm tempted. So as a former central banker, and the one was in charge of producing nowcasts. So there was often discrepancy between these nowcasts and inflation expectations measured in markets. So I know that historically, obviously, these things are hard to find, but just as a sensitivity analysis, maybe you can look at something from the bond markets in terms of nominal interest rates versus gold linked, or some gold, a country that left the gold later, and try to see, just as a sensitivity analysis to.
I think we present a bit of that sort of evidence in the appendix for Britain and the States, and I mean, I think people like Hamilton and so on haven't they done that sort of thing. But yeah, I agree. I think that the more ways that we can validate our measures of inflation expectations, the better. I think for us rhetorically.
Okay, so yep, thank you. So thank you very much. So I guess we were right on time. So we're taking a 20-minute, roughly 19-minute break, and we'll resume in 19 minutes. So it will be 4 o'clock London time, but anyone can. I mean, we're all over the world, so they just say 18 minutes from now.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So thank you again, all, and see you in the next session.
Kevin, you need to mute yourself.
Okay.
Sorry, we don't want to hear your conversation. Right. John, do you want to try sharing out your slides if you have them?
Great. Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yep, it's working.
Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
How are
can
you?
leave it there. We're 2 minutes from starting.
Yeah, good. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. Considering I just got my second vaccine shot, so I'm feeling better about myself. So.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah. I had rotator cuff surgery on my shoulder, and I had a doctor's appointment this morning that I thought was yesterday. That's why I screwed up the schedule.
That's fine. That's fine. Minor change. Yeah. Good. Good. All right. So we're 1 minute off.
Do you want me to stop the sharing or just stick with it?
No, you may as well leave it. I mean, we're just
okay.
just 1 minute from starting. Yeah.
Great.
Anyway, you made it, John.
I made it. Hey, Steve.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing good. But I'm having, did I get, there we go. My video's back on. I'm doing fine. Maybe we can Zoom sometime next week. I'm ready to get paper back online.
Get back to that, yeah.
Yeah, no, I've been working on this book and I'm just about done. And I've learned a tremendous amount about 19th century European history in the last year, which will amount to a paragraph and a half in the string theory paper, but I'll feel much better about it.
Right.
Rui, I just saw your message. Can't hear you. Your sound isn't on.
Okay.
Sorry?
Yes.
John?
Yes, now you're on.
Oh, I was. Oh, I'm sorry. So I gave you all the spiel. Okay, just repeating, 4th session of the symposium. Slight change of schedule. We'll start with the last session from the previous session, which will be presented by John Wallis on making rules in personal, historical, and institutional foundations of general laws in the United States. It's a very long title and a paper full of content, but John, you only have 20 minutes, and because we definitely want to ask you questions after that. Go for it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in the program. I think it's the 3rd time it's a charm. The last time I gave a paper at this meeting was in Stockholm, no, Oslo, a while back. And then since then, I've tried to be on the program several times, and I had a health problem, then I had a COVID problem, so anyway, I finally made it. So it's great to be here. This is a project that's related to a book I've been working on for a long time. It's also related to a project I'm doing with Naomi Lamoureux and part of a project with Ron Harris, which you'll see as we go through. One of the key constraints in economic development and the institutions regarding development are societies developing the capacity to create rules that treat everyone the same, what I call impersonal rules. This is just a quote from Doug North in his Institutional Change in Economic Performance, where he emphasizes the importance of impersonal exchange with third-party enforcement. Massimo, Johnston, Robinson have a classic argument that we think of good economic institutions as those that provide security of property rights and relatively equal access to economic resources. That is, that the property rights have to apply equally to everyone. So we want to know how we get from societies that don't have impersonal rules, where most of the rules apply differently to different people, to societies with impersonal rules. Those questions about why and how that happens are really complicated. They're beyond the scope of this paper. I have lots of ideas about why and how it happened, but we can't answer those questions unless we know when and where it actually happened. And honestly, we don't. Naomi and I have worked on early 19th century American economic history for a long time, and we didn't realize when and where it happened until 4 or 5 years ago. And it was as a result of working on a different problem. So this paper documents when and where states in the United States made the transition to impersonal rules. And I'll talk a little bit about Britain as well. The version of the paper posted on the conference website is an old version. We've since done quite a bit of research, but we have not updated the paper. I was hoping to, but I haven't had time yet. I'll talk about that. So we're going to talk about 2 points today. One is that the legal regime in the United States before 1840 involved the creation of what were called at the time private, special, and local laws. Private law applied to one or a few specific persons. A special law applied to one organization, typically a corporation, but not always. And a local law applied to one locality. And as we'll see, and I'll document in a few slides, roughly 75% of all the laws passed by American state legislatures before 1840 were private, special, or local legislation. So this was the common way of doing things. It was not that there was a few exceptional bills for specific individuals. That's the way the legislature worked. That's how these early democracies functioned. There were also private bills in the United Kingdom, in Britain. Private does not mean exactly the same thing in Britain as it does in the United States, although there's some similarities. There were also local bills in Britain, and I'll talk about those very briefly as we go through so you can see. We've actually figured out, we think, more or less how Britain made this transition as well in roughly the same time period, the 1840s and 1850s. Second, that states did this by restricting the ability of legislatures to create private laws, special laws, or local laws, and mandating that the legislatures pass what in America is known as general laws. And the first of these laws, these mandates, were provisions for general laws for incorporation. That's the work that Naomi and I have done over the last 20 or 30 years in our career. But as I'll show, and that's what we focused on when we were involved in this research. But we realized that those general law provisions for incorporation spread quickly to other purposes and other types of legislation. And as well, the parallel process happened in Britain. And that's what really opened our eyes to the fact that this was not something that existed anywhere before the 1840s. And there was a real fundamental shift in the content and form of legislation. The reason this is so important is that just if we think about a simple democratic legislature, in order to pass legislation, in order to create a new rule, you have to obtain a majority. And it's a whole lot easier to do that when you get to 48% of the legislature and you can create a bill for one guy, one person, one organization, one town, and pull them into the majority coalition. And that's a powerful legislative tool. And this has a lot of implications in how legislatures are organized and how political parties work that I'm not going to talk about today, but I can talk about a little bit in the Q&A. So these restrictions meant that most of the bills that the legislatures or the parliament had been passing prior to the 1840s could no longer be passed. They would not fall under the rubric. And so we're going to show, this paper is basically about the fact that demonstrating that things changed and how they changed, and that there's a very visible record of it. This is not something that's hidden in the sands of time. This does not require an instrumental variable scheme to demonstrate it. It's very clear in the historical record. So Indiana was the first state in 1851 to pass what I'll call a general law provision. That is that most laws should be applied equally to everyone. These are the 3 clauses in the 1851 Constitution. The first clause, which I will not read, lists 17 things for which the legislature must pass a general law that applies equally to everyone. The second provision says, in cases not enumerated in previous sections, The state should pass a general law whenever possible. And the third says corporations shall not be created by special act, but must be formed under a general law. That is, the legislature cannot create an individual corporation with a specific charter. All charters must be the same, and they must be the same as that authorized in the general act. So as I said, there were general incorporation laws. Then there were general laws for municipal incorporations, which turns out to be actually quite an important thing that we'll see, particularly in Britain. And then these general law provisions. So the following graph, this graph just says on a vertical axis when a state in the United States passed a mandate requiring a general law provision. So those were like the Indiana provision of 1851. So widespread. The details of these things vary from every state. And on the horizontal axis, the year that the states banned private charters of incorporation. It turned out this was important because if you didn't ban special incorporation, then the state could still create a special economic entity with unique privileges in its charter, and that was banned. And as you can see, a lot of the states lie on the 45-degree line. They did this at the same time. Most of the states that entered the Union after 1848, with Wisconsin, did both of these at the time they entered. So that's part of the reason there's such a strong 45-degree line. And this is just a table that for given years in different states, when did they amend or adopt a new constitution? When did they ban special charters? And when did they mandate general laws? Okay, so in England, there were private bills and there were also public bills. These didn't quite correspond to what happens in America, but they're close. Private bills were petitions sent to Parliament. They were handled through a special set of procedures. These were laid out in what are called the Standing Orders of Parliament. The Standing Orders were first printed in 1803. They'd existed for several centuries. In the 1846 revision, there were 159 standing orders to govern how private bills were treated. And one of the interesting things about this is that private bills, as it moved through the legislative process, had to pay fees to clerks. And so we won't have an accurate count of how many clerks there were in Parliament handling these parliamentary private bills, but they were large. Julian Hoppett, who did a great study of the political economy of Parliament and British government in the 17th and 18th century, said that you really can't use the distinction between public and private bills. He said it's much more helpful to distinguish between legislation which appears to be general, is intended to reach everyone, from that which was specific, legislation intended to affect a single individual or town or corporation. And he estimates between 1660 and 1800 that 73% of the acts of Parliament were specific acts. So this was the mode in which Parliament functioned. This disappeared for two reasons. The government began taking up more Parliament's time in the 1840s, and it squeezed out the time available to pass private bills. At one point, they were actually holding lotteries to decide which private bills would come up for vote. But then the major institutional change was something called a Clause Consolidation Act. It was passed in the 1840s. There was 11 of these. They were for things like railroads and corporations, enclosures, waterworks. And what a Clause Consolidation Act said was, here's the terms that will apply to all acts about railroads and all acts about enclosure and all acts about corporations. So it was very much like a general act in the United States. So a local bill, which would apply to a specific town, would start with invoking the Clause Consolidation Act. So that the Clause Consolidation Act terms would apply to all the bills. So it's not quite the general law provision in the United States, but it's an attempt to impose uniformity on all the legislation. We've been doing some work with Ron Harris on the 19th century acts of Parliament. And so the following graph has local acts, private and personal acts, and public acts. So the orange line at the top is local acts. And as you can see, this starts in 1803 and goes to 1902. That local acts have increased in number over time. Public acts have declined, but are still significant. And private and personal acts, the gray line on the bottom, virtually disappeared. By the time we get to 1900, I think there's only 5 private acts, and all of them are for divorces. So what's happened is that the bulk of the legislation in Britain has moved into these local acts that are governed by loss consolidation. So they're moving to impersonal rules as well. In the United States, the states often publish 2 volumes of laws, one which were the public acts and one which were the private acts. And you can easily segregate the laws. That way, there was one for Connecticut that Bill Novak utilized in a paper. There was Indiana did it as well. Naomi has had a group of students at Yale going through and reading all the titles and brief descriptions of the acts and identifying different types of acts. And so we can track what the different states were doing before and after the Constitution. So here's for selected years, every 5 years in Indiana, the number of laws that were passed in the first column, the number of general laws in the second column, as a percentage of total in the third column. As you can see, before 1850, in only 1 year did general laws comprise 13% of the legislation of Indiana. After the Constitution was written in 1851, general laws occupied usually 50 to 60% of all the laws. There was 1 year in which it was only 40%. And over here, we have local laws for local governments. In the early period, those were always at least 50% of the legislative output. After the act, it was down to 35% at the most, usually around 15%. And private laws, as a percentage of the total laws, went from somewhere around 25 to 30% down to less than 10%. So there was a marked shift in the composition of the acts, as documented here in Indiana. We've been working on other states. COVID brought that work to a halt because undergraduates are no longer at Yale, and they're scattered around. So we're continuing to work on it. But what we've been able to show is this before and after pattern really works. So here's a series of states that adopt the general law provisions.
John, 5 minutes, please.
Yep, I'm almost done. And you can see that in the upper panel, states that adopted and banned charters, special charters, and adopted general laws, private laws went from 35% to less than 10%. Same thing happened in the second group. This is groups that banned them after the Civil War. At the bottom are Connecticut and Delaware, and they neither banned special charters nor mandated general laws before 1885. And about 50% of their laws were private laws before, and that remained at 20 to 40%. So the states that did not adopt these provisions did not have the change. It's easier to count bills than to actually figure out what their titles are. So when, as you can see here in Indiana, when Indiana passed this law, put the restriction in, the number of bills the Indiana legislature passed dropped sharply. So here is a graph for Indiana. This is the number of laws passed in each session. And the red line is when they adopted the constitutional provision. Here's a similar graph for Ohio, for Pennsylvania, and California. You can see there's a sharp drop in the volume of legislation right after the provision is put in, because you're not passing all these idiosyncratic individualized laws for towns, corporations, and individuals. Massachusetts and Connecticut did not change their constitution, and there's what their number of laws looks over the same period from 1830 to 1885. There's no constitutional provision, and there's no decline in the number of laws passed per session. We started to do work sorting the types of laws that are passed. So here's for California, and the gray area is special laws for local governments. The orange area is special laws for state governments, that is, laws that apply to a specific state agency. So they're not special in the sense of providing for individuals outside of the government, they're laws within the government. Blue is general laws, and the lighter orange color, I guess I have two orange colors, the kind of yellowish color, are private laws. And as you can see, between 1860 and 1885, the wedge for general laws increases in size significantly, and the private law wedge virtually disappears. Here is, I can't see this at the top, I think this is for Indiana. My screen doesn't quite work that way. This is, I believe this is Ohio. This is Connecticut. Remember, Connecticut did not pass a general law provision, so we're comparing 1850 and 1860. And as you can see, the volume of general laws is going up in Connecticut, even though they don't have a constitutional restriction. But special private legislation is still roughly 40%, declines to about 30% in Connecticut. So these are very common. So this is a real change that happened, and we don't know about this. I actually emailed Julian Hoppett and said, hey, when did Britain adopt impersonal rules? When did they adopt a restriction that said all the rules had to treat everybody the same? And he wrote back and he said, I don't know. Maybe, he gave me some people to ask, and I asked them, and there is nobody knows about this in the United States. Naomi and I had to study these laws, general incorporation laws, for a good bit of our career, and we did not understand that the 1851 provision in Indiana was much more important than the general incorporation law in New York or the Free Banking Act in 1836, because it applied to everything the state did. These provisions were enforced. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I can address that in the Q&A if you like. These changes happened in the most visible way, and they had a dramatic effect on how legislatures behaved. And in the paper, but I won't talk about, they really were enforced. We need to understand this, and we aren't going to be able to understand it until we actually look at the times and places when these changes occurred. And then it turns out in the half century or so afterwards, for when those laws were actually sustained. And the important thing first is to understand that it happened. And that's it for me. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks a lot. Right in the mark. Thanks for the great presentation. Now we need to do our job, which is to ask you important and insightful questions. So the audience and the other panelists feel free to pitch in. But while they collect their thoughts, let me start with a couple. So the first one is about precisely how you concluded, right? So you infer that so long as this mass of private or local legislation doesn't disappear from the work of Parliament, this was an hindrance to impersonal application of the law. But in fact, many of these private bills, as they're called in the UK, were there as a way of redistributing property rights, establishing intellectual property rights, and doing a number of other things that eventually were very favorable to economic growth and everything else, right? And so my question here, I guess, is what is impersonal here? Is it the fact that, for instance, you can incorporate simply by filling a form and verifying all the predetermined requirements in the law after general incorporation? Or is it the fact that you're treated by a parliament the same way that anyone else who wants to incorporate prior to the passage of this incorporation law? So isn't this also a case of impersonal application of perhaps procedures rather than regulations? Which essentially the question is, isn't what you're describing effectively the professionalization of regulation of the economy, which used to be done by parliaments and then eventually became done by ministers, right? So this became an administrative process. And the other thing, this is about data, right? So there's many ways of splicing this data, not only in terms of local or local for state, local for local governments, but also in terms of the content of these private bills. In the case of the UK, I think it makes sense to distinguish between enclosure, statutory authority, and the state acts. And the statutory authority eventually became a very important one. And I was a bit surprised that you classified the jump in railway incorporation laws in 1847 as local bills, right? They were local in the way that they were classified because of historical precedent and tradition, but not in terms of the consequences. Sorry, I'm taking far too much time. Go ahead.
The jump in 1847, in the 1840s in railroad bills would be in private bills because they were all called private. Okay. I think you're absolutely right about the administrative shift, and that's the way we interpret this. And that's how we've seen it. And the fact is that when I was in China 5 years ago, I said to my students, I was at Fudan University, I said, well, how many of you, when you have a problem with registering your car, go to the motor vehicles department and wait in line? And how many of you call your friends? And they said, they all raised their hand and said, we call our friend. Yeah. Because even though China has a big bureaucracy, the bureaucracy works by treating people individually. And this is a symptom, not just of how the bureaucracy works, but how the entire political system works. So this was the argument that North and Weingast and I made in Violence and Social Orders, is that in what we call natural states, the political process requires the manipulation of economic privileges to hold political coalitions together. And when you restrict the ability to manipulate economic privileges, then you have to change the way the political system holds together or it will blow up. And that's why this is so important. And then what we see in the places that actually become modern, their bureaucracy, their administrative structures change. They become more impersonal. They become more bureaucratic. That's Max Weber, right? We all know that. But this is actually, we don't think of that as happening because of a change in the rules. And of course, it happens in the places that change the rules, and it very rarely happens in places that don't.
Okay, Steve, you're next, and then I'll give the word to Guillaume Dodin.
Okay, I mean, I was in some sense struck by the fact that coming from an institutional economic historian, you're saying there's this formal change which happens in 1 year and everything dramatically changes. And thinking in terms of Doug North's work, shouldn't we expect that it's going to be a more gradual process? There's informal things have to change around it. And I'd expect to see something about that, because otherwise you'd think there'd be, reports of mass protests if everything was really changing so much. So can you say a little bit about, you called it enforcement, but maybe just more generally about how dramatic the change really was. I mean, you can see things being not so different if the railways are still being built from A to B and they're local in some sense, then changing the rules around that, it may not seem as such a dramatic change.
So I think you're absolutely right. The way this affected the society was not so dramatic as to what happened to the legislative content in Indiana between 1850 and 1855. What we were struck by, and we had no idea we were going to find this, was that in fact there was this marked impact on what the legislatures were doing. As you can see, it spread throughout the United States. It took 70 years for all the states to adopt this. It didn't happen. That did not happen instantaneously. And then it's very interesting. Americans today mostly believe that the Constitution requires equal protection under the law, or at least the 14th Amendment. And but yet, when we go back and look at the laws, they didn't, right? So that the norms and beliefs that Doug would talk about that evolved and clearly did evolve were not present before 1840, and they changed, right? So I think there's a much more of this process about how this actually affected legislatures and what that did to norms and values, what it did to the beliefs and how the political system operated. Like one of the implications was what Rui talked about, is that all of a sudden you begin to get administrative and regulatory states. If every company can get a charter that allows it to have its own laws, forget regulating them, right? So there was a whole bunch of things that came in its wake that this paper does not address. And I don't think you're wrong in saying that this was not an instantaneous change. But it just turns out, in the case of the way that legislatures in the American states operated, that it was a pretty instantaneous change. It had a big impact dramatically.
Good. Guillaume, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. I was just wondering, how much do you think this story is linked to the common law system? Do you think is the situation similar in Roman law countries? Do we know when this shift is happening there? Thanks.
Yeah, so this is not a common law story particularly, although there are aspects of the common law in which the rules would apply equally everywhere. Of course, those rules were identity rules. They weren't rules that treated everyone the same. I apologize for this. There is no history of this in the civil law countries. I've been trying to find people and read about things. I'm limited because I'm basically an American economic historian. That we don't really know. I was in Sweden. I presented a version of this paper a couple of years ago, and Bo Rothstein, he's a political scientist who works on corruption, said, I don't know when this happened in Sweden. It must have happened in Sweden, but I don't know when it happened. And so I'm trying to get people to think about when this actually occurred and how it occurred, because obviously the British story is much different than the American story. It's a parallel institutional process at a very general level, but not at a specific level. And I think what I'm hoping that this research will stimulate is legal historians going back and trying to figure out when this occurred in civil law countries as well.
Great. Any more questions from the audience, the panelists? Oh, okay, so I have a final one. So you mentioned that this happened very quickly in the US, right? In the 1840s and 50s, but some states.
No, in one state.
Yeah, right.
It took half a century to occur in the US, totally.
Yeah, but if the outcome of these constitutional provisions was so dramatic, then this this raises the question about the timing whereby these states adopted these constitutions. And since they didn't do it all at the same time, do you see any evidence of learning? You know, Indiana perhaps led the game, the other states saw it was good and they decided this is the solution. Was there learning or was it independent?
No, they definitely learned. So Naomi and I have a paper coming out in the Journal of the Early Republic, which is an American history journal, which documents actually how these things spread and what people were learning and how they were talking about it. I have a paper with a graduate student in a volume that Naomi edited, showing, just looking at the debates at the constitutional conventions in the late 19th century. And they're clearly talking about, hey, this worked in Indiana, this worked in Tennessee, what we're doing isn't working, we're having troubles, we should adopt a procedure. And you can see some of the states actually go through several steps along the way in moving to general law provisions. But by the late 19th century, most states, with the exception of some in New England, which they do it by statutory rather than constitutions, have made similar constitutional changes.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've run out of time, interesting as this is. I also don't know when this happened in my own country, but now I'm picked and I want to know. And perhaps we've just started a trend, a new research area right now amongst ourselves. But now we do need to move to the next paper. And the next paper will be presented by David Jacks from Simon Fraser University. And it's entitled The Gravitational Constant. David, are you ready?
Yeah, hold on just a second here.
Oh.
How are we looking over there?
Very good.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks for the incorporation on the program today. This is the gravitational constant with Kevin and Alan. This is a project we've been working on for probably more years than I care to admit. So we're very interested in hearing what you have to say here. To begin, I think one of the things I'll do, in thinking about how to motivate this, just kind of borrowing a page from Peter Neary in a recent paper, who also makes this unapologetic case for gravity. In case you're wondering, do we really need another paper on this topic? And it kind of springs in terms of that motivation from this fact that, or this idea that, really we can think of gravity as being this empirical fact for the present day. In terms of theory, this is really something that we're looking for as an outcome, and thereby kind of a guidepost for all theories of trade now, regardless of kind of the nature of the drivers of specialization in international trade. And so we kind of think of this then as a useful tool for potentially understanding the global economy in that long run. So we think of this also as this kind of relative success story for modern economics, and particularly modern kind of international trade theory. So then, what do we actually mean then by gravity, just to get everyone on the same page? It's just this idea then that at the bilateral level, trade is going to be governed by the attractive force of economic mass on the one hand, but then mitigated by the presence of trade costs on the other, right? So we have kind of frictions on one side of the scale, kind of working in the opposite direction of something like GDP or output, which is really kind of a characterization of the level of demand and the destination for exports. So the intuition here is that basically gravity is merely indicating how consumers are allocating spending across countries. So as individuals, face basically, their own personalized budget constraints, they're kind of confronted with prices in the domestic economy, which are a combination of the production costs for individual traded goods and trade costs themselves, right? So the cost of actually getting them to the domestic market. So one way of thinking about this in terms of a very easy, kind of intuition then is that, basically gravity is just characterizing demand in a simple general equilibrium system, right? So this is then, a further rationalization is why we might like this, in a long run kind of empirical approach over, as I'll show you a couple of centuries, is this idea then that regardless of what's going on the supply side of the economies of the world, regardless of what's happening there in terms of the specialization which is driving trade, we can abstract away from all of that, right, and simply use gravity to kind of understand, on the one hand, these kind of demand components, but also really for our purposes, those frictions, right, in the presence of things such as transport, commercial policy, communication, et cetera. So one of the things that we really kind of have as our kind of driving question for this paper, right, is then answering this question of how far in the past gravity actually holds. So there's some more recent literature by Barjamovich et al., Fluker et al., which is relying on archaeological records. So, the presence of trade in narrative accounts in the case of Barjamovich et al., the archaeological remains of pottery trade in the Roman Empire for Fluker et al. But what really kind of sets our paper off, I think, is the fact that we're actually observing trade all the way back to 1700 over this period up to 1899. It's a new and large data set on British bilateral commodity level exports, imports, and re-exports. But today we're just going to focus on this export activity of Britain. So then we're going to kind of pit basically two primary trade frictions that we can kind of consistently measure and think about over this 200-year period. Thinking about then the effects of trade diminishing distance versus the trade enhancing effects of the British Empire. The data itself, which is a key feature of the paper, and we kind of highlight this in the draft, thinking about this as a contribution, not only in terms of a kind of the extended academic literature, but also in terms of primary data that others are going to have access to at some point in the future. So the primary source here is the Customs and Excise Department's ledgers of imports and exports published annually from 1697 to 1899. As a kind of raw data source, this is something which is familiar to those who work or are familiar with trade history. It's the same data underlying Schulte, Schumpeter, Davis, 1979. So what we've taken as our goal with this kind of raw input is basically in terms of replicating the full structure of the ledgers, right? So the ledgers actually contain a line-by-line account of commodity-level bilateral trade flows in between Britain and the rest of the world. We interpret these as the full population of flows. We think that's a pretty easy kind of assumption for the fact that they're registering or recording flows of value of 10 to 15 shillings, even at certain points in time. So then again, our kind of long run project has dealt with kind of fully replicating that structure of the ledgers. We've done this at 10-year intervals from 1700 to 1899, so 1700, 1710, 1720, giving us then in totality 21 cross sections over that 200 years. And only then, once we fully replicated that structure of the ledgers, do we start to actually aggregate up, right? So there's a few things, particularities about the data itself that I'm going to go into. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I think it might actually help you in kind of understanding what we do in this paper. So there's issues in terms of how trade, and particularly transshipment trade, is recorded, how destinations for British exports are recorded, becoming more disaggregated over time. So basically what we've done is then just kind of define 99 consistent geographic areas, we could call them countries, to assign consistent country identifiers over those 200 years. So then, to give you an example of this, that basically we merge all observations on China and Hong Kong into this kind of greater China country, as it were. So then, what that means is that we have, over 220,000 observations on exports to deal with. Another kind of element of aggregation that we have to contend with is that as the structure of the British economy evolves over time, there's also these kind of changes in the structure of exports. So we see the disappearance of, say, human hair as an export from Britain, and kind of the arrival and introduction of, say, railway carriages as an export. So what we do then is, again, assigning, consistent, 2-digit SITC codes over those 200 years. For every observation, we can place it into one of these aggregate kind of country industry cells defined at the 2-digit level for industries. And again, we interpret the ledgers as the universe of British trade. And so we thereby rectangularize the data by treating missing data, in particular industry country cells in a year, as zeros. So what that amounts to then is that we have these 99 countries, we have 57 industries defined at the 2-digit SITC level, amounting to around 5,600 observations per year, right? And then those 21 years at our disposal. Another kind of element that we have to contend with as well, which is going to rationalize our particular form of estimation, is that basically the prices are fixed from 1700 up to 1813, which is great if you're looking for a real measure of exports. Not so great if you're thinking about using this in a panel context where you would potentially be mixing nominal and real values in any kind of estimation, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to include industry level fixed effects to control for differences in relative price levels within years. And we're also going to estimate the gravity equation on a year-by-year basis rather than a panel context. So in the paper, we consider a simple Armington-based model with, kind of CES demand for, the countries of the world with identical CES preferences, and, this kind of presence of trade costs in this kind of iceberg form, which are industry specific. Why we do this is that it then kind of suggests basically a very specific estimating equation for structural gravity at the industry level that we should consider, right? So that exports from Britain to, say, Canada in railway carriages is going to be then a function of factors which are specific to particular industries, but common to all countries. There's also going to be, very importantly, these exporter industry and importer industry combinations, which are there to capture kind of these multilateral effects, which are effectively kind of the unobserved barriers to trade. So, what might matter for British exports to Canada, it's not just what those two countries are doing, but also what, say, the United States is doing in terms of its trade policy. That's also going to suggest that we include these industry country pairs as fixed effects, and then basically to consider industry specific bilateral trade costs. Now, so the structure of our data is such that we can't follow this, particularly to the letter of the law, for the fact that we're only looking at British exports, right? So this I subindex in particular is going to collapse, right? Because we don't have variation in the exporter. We're also going to have to basically substitute in the GDP of the destination country for basically a placeholder for both the multilateral effects I spoke to and the kind of standard gravity output effects, right? So, with that, what we'll kind of have is, this compromised situation. We'll try to do our best in terms of proxying for the former multilateral effects as robustness, coming up with effectively the same results. So that's somewhat reassuring. But the basic kind of estimating equation that we have on a year-by-year basis is that, you know, exports from Britain to, you know, country J in industry K is going to be, you know, a function of then these kind of industry-specific fixed effects. Again, that kind of output effect is captured by GDP, and then we're actually, you know, going to be assigning all residual variation into that error term. And we're also going to be considering, you know, these distance and empire coefficients collected on this kind of year-by-year basis, where for presentation purposes, for the purposes of the draft or the paper, we're not going to really concern ourselves with these kind of industry-specific things and only thinking about this more or less kind of aggregate story for the British economy. So to give you some sense of what the data itself looks like, you know, in terms of, you know, some, you know, overview kind of patterns, we see that, you know, real exports kind of at the aggregate level increase by a factor of around 35 over this period of time from 1700 to 1900. And it's not necessarily, you know, easy and steady growth throughout. There seems to be these kind of, you know, periods of particular punctuated trade growth. So some of it, you know, after 1780, some of it, you know, from 1840 to 69, which we think is very interesting, but we won't dwell on here. We can also kind of break out in terms of, you know, the margins of trade, thinking about those 5,600 cells by industry, by country, by year. You know, how many of those are non-zero? How many are those then also capturing non-zero trade at the country level, right? So what we get there is a rough kind of stability from 1700 to 1800, suggesting that most of the trade growth that I showed in the previous slide was coming on this intensive margin, so an existing industry country cell combinations. But that after 1800, we get a lot of trade growth, which is, you know, more along the lines of increasing the number of both countries and industries with which you know, Britain is trading with. And we also get this kind of perspective, you know, in thinking about that share of British Empire over time, and that, you know, the real loss to that British Empire share accompanying the independence of the United States after 1780. So in terms of, you know, those broad contours, then we can actually go to kind of estimation. So as I said before, we're going to estimate this industry level gravity equation using variation in the actual values of trade. In other words, how much Britain exports to these 99 countries across the 57 industries. We're going to have time varying distance and empire coefficients coming from the fact that we'll run a regression for 1700, collect the coefficients, go to 1710, run the regression, collect the coefficients, and do so under, you know, the guise of PPML, so that we can use the information for zeros and actually avoid some of this bias that comes out of OLS. So giving you the kind of, you know, the collection of the coefficients there, right, for these kind of simultaneously estimated distance and empire coefficients, what we see is that, you know, in 1700s, that basically that we, you know, replicate this familiar unitary elasticity in between kind of bilateral trade and distance up until 1780, right? So that unitary elasticity is something that we know for the present day. But curiously, this collapses so that by, you know, sometime in the 1800s, we kind of see this, you know, relative death of distance, at least for British exports, right? Turning to empire, right, the effect peaks in 1780, so probably related to US independence, with another significant drop in 1850, right? Another thing that we do then is also turn to a different form of estimation rather than relying on the kind of the values of bilateral exports. Here, we're just going to be relying on basically whether or not Britain exports, right? So a 0-1, which is going to, you know, allow us to kind of proceed via probit. There we get very kind of similar results with a different kind of interpretation of the coefficients, of course, but that we have stability for both distance and empire up to 1750. We get this kind of zeroing out of the distance coefficient in particular right by 1900. And we kind of see the pronounced drops in 1780 and 1850 that we documented before with PPML. So to kind of wrap things up, what we have as a set of conclusions is that, from the late 1700s, the UK seems to have somewhat escaped the forces of gravity, at least as mediated, via physical distance. This presents a little bit of an irony then that once you kind of move things up to 1900, its trading patterns in a relative sense, right, seem to be more strongly influenced not by distance, but the kind of political construct of British Empire, right? And so we think that's the irony coming from, this being the period of kind of laissez-faire free trade, but really it's something, more about, geopolitics in the background. So what this means in combination is that, gravity was indeed in effect from as early as 1700, but not constant in its operation. And we don't think that the time-varying elasticities that we kind of generate are really surprising. There's these radical changes in communication, policy, transport, but it is somewhat puzzling that the gravity effects that we document are strongest in 1700 to 1900. And I think this raises an interesting idea or point that how we interpret distance in the present, in the context of gravity equations, is that oftentimes, folks like to think that this is somehow exogenous, right? And so distance, being what it is, that then leads itself perhaps naturally to vaguely, causal interpretations. So if you think about that policy discussion around Brexit, many people invoke this iron law of distance coming from gravity estimation, that if you double distance, you're gonna necessarily have to be having the level of bilateral exports. But what this kind of paper then reminds us is that while physical distance is indeed fixed, this traded distance, which is what we're actually kind of marking out, is actually a policy outcome, and one which is subject to geopolitical considerations, which are of course varying over time. Okay, so I think I can stop the share. It looks like we're good for time.
Indeed we are. Perfect timing from you. Thank you, David. The usual invitation to the assembled audience for questions. But I will use my proverbial privilege, and then I'll give the word to Chris Mitchner, who already raised his hand. But my question, so I understand what you want to do here, right? So you want to talk about the surprising disappearance of gravity and the greater persistence of empire. But this is only off by a couple of decades, and even the empire effect eventually converges to nothing or close to that. So isn't this doubly surprising if it was neither empire, and so your politically influenced distance, or just the pure iron law of distance? What was driving increasingly these trade relations towards the early 20th century?
Yeah, so I think we have to be a little bit careful, and it probably doesn't come quite out in that presentation as much as the draft, right? That there are air bands here, right? So we're just working off of the kind of point estimates. But then, thinking about, say, what you're saying in terms of the relative irrelevance of empire, it doesn't disappear, but the relative kind of magnitude does kind of diminish over time, right? So yeah, it is a little bit inherently of a paradox of what's kind of driving it. One of the things that might be back there in the background, of course, when you think about gravity, it's not just about those output effects and distance. It's also, it's not just those distance and empire effects, there's also output working in the background, right? So one of the things that we need to kind of consider then is how much more of the variation in bilateral trade flows is actually being captured by GDP itself, right? And then, whether there's kind of any sort of shift in, say, inherently the multilateral effects, right? So do these start to predominate more in terms of understanding, magnitudes of British exports? That could be another avenue that we need to explore for sure.
Right, I would expect that as the trade network becomes more dense, right, after 1800. Chris.
Right. Oh, thanks. Really interesting data, David. Couple questions. One, of course, and I know you're aware of this, is that wouldn't we want to put this in the context of the fact that Britain as a share of global trade is probably also changing over this long interval? And as we move into the 19th century, we're going to have an increasingly dense trade network that's non-British. So then making, and it doesn't affect your final conclusion, of course, but making other statements about how global trade flows are shifting is kind of dangerous because we're just focusing on British trade in this paper. So that's one point. And the other one, which I'm just curious about, is it wasn't altogether clear to me what we're gaining by going down to the commodity level. That in a sense, most of the results you presented, and again, there could be more in the paper, which I admit haven't read carefully. One dimension I think that's really interesting that I'm sure you have some thoughts on is the expanded variety of goods that are being traded as these transportation costs decline over the 19th century. So I was hoping your paper would speak to that, as someone who often teaches this stuff and tries to impress upon students that there was this earlier wave of globalization. What can we learn from this super long data about the extensive margin in terms of the products? And there's where I thought I was hoping your data would speak to that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So on that, in terms of the more, I guess, generality of the results, one of the things that we do have in the later section of the paper, and which had to be excluded from the presentation, is this concern that, is there just something particular about this data set? Is there something just particular about Britain? So what we can do there is actually go to an independent data set, which basically coming through the collaboration with Chris Meisner and Disnovi, and looking at this period of time from 1870 to 2010, and thinking about this exercise for not just Britain, but the entirety of the world, and kind of tracing out those distance and empire effects. And so the distance effects in particular are very interesting for the fact that Britain has the same zero-ish coefficient, right, in this aggregate bilateral trade data set as it does in ours, right? It's also the fact that other countries have systematically lower, in terms of absolute value, distance coefficients in the 19th century as they do in the late 20th century, right? So a coefficient value on average of 0.5 in absolute terms, versus this unitary elasticity that everyone is familiar with in the present day, right? And so what's also interesting about that is that sometime in the 1950s and 60s, the world, the patterns of world trade collapse or converge on this -1 value, right? So it is something which is a little bit particular to Britain in terms of the zero value, but it's not particular to Britain in terms of a different profile from what we expect in the present day. So this is again one of these kind of paradoxes or puzzles that we need to kind of resolve or think about. So in answer to your second question about what we're actually gaining from the industry level kind of estimation and perspective, a lot of this actually deals with the issues I spoke to a little bit and very quickly in the slides regarding kind of aggregation, right? And this kind of shifting terms of how trade is actually valued. It turns out this industry kind of level perspective, because it allows us to include these industry level fixed effects, we think that's going to be a much more fruitful path to follow if we're particularly concerned about how to necessarily deflate nominal nominal export values over this 2 centuries, right? So it is kind of this issue with respect to kind of underlying export price indices. We don't have that data, and I don't think we ever will. So then that the industry level fixed effects allow us to basically control for these relative differences in the changes in the industry specific price indices over time. So that's a partial answer, I think, to your question. As to this idea of kind of variety and what was going on there, there are at least a couple of slides in the presentation and also in the paper related to, and I think it came out, in terms of that non-zero share of countries and non-zero share of industries. I think that's about the best that we're going to be able to do with this, for the fact that there's just so much flux in both how trade is recorded and that kind of what level of disaggregation for products, but then also what products the British economy is actually producing, right? So it might be a little bit more fruitful then to actually think about variety more or less at this kind of relatively finely disaggregated industry level.
Good. So there's only time to mention the questions on the Q&A, and they're similar. They're essentially referring to standard frictions in these gravity models, be it common language, legal system, religion, tariff protection, right? And and also Guillaume Dodin asks whether there might be an aggregate, a direct effect of the aggregate trade openness of the UK economy onto this bilateral composition of trade.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, these are all good suggestions. So, with this in terms of adding further controls such as common language legal system, I believe in further, or earlier iterations of estimation, we have tried this. I think the component is, what will be bearing for us is, how much of this is not necessarily in the exercise in terms of kind of explaining all of the variation in UK export flows, but in terms of understanding for these particular purposes, this evolution of the kind of distance and empire coefficients over time. So what's going to matter there is to what extent are those common language, legal systems, et cetera, correlated with what we're trying to actually measure? And I think there might be some, possibility there of, particularly empire capturing a lot of these kind of other effects. But we don't necessarily think that that's going to kind of change in a way the larger story about these kind of diminishing coefficients over time. As to Guillaume's point, maybe this is best if I address this individually, because I think we're right at 9 a.m. and I don't want to get into anyone else's time, as it were, right? So
right. Thanks for your forbearance. Thank you very much to all the authors. They're all together here with us. And we move to the third and last paper of today, the Smooth-Hawley Trade War, joint paper by Kirsten Van Schneider and Chris Mitchner, and Kevin O'Rourke, and Kirsten will present it.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can see the slides and that's working. Yeah, thanks so much for including the paper in the program. And as you already said, this is joint work with Chris and Kevin. They're both here and they can chime in the discussion. So the topic of this paper is the Smoot-Hawley trade war. And what provoked us to re-examine the Smoot-Hawley, so to some extent there's a historical motivation, but also a more contemporary motivation for this paper, was that US trade policy under Trump was very much in the spirit of a trade war. And this tweet sort of exemplifies this. When a country, the USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. Example, when we're down 100 billion with a certain country, they get cute, don't trade anymore, we win big, it's easy. And while this sort of reflects a misunderstanding about winners and losers of trade, it also suggests that trade wars are an effective policy instrument and that it can work in favor of the US. And in that context, the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill of the 1930s has often been cited as a cautionary tale of a trade war. It's associated with a disastrous decline in trade in the 1930s. It's seen as a contributor to the severity of the Great Depression. Harold James has termed it as the end of globalization. But generally, economic historians have generally not ascribed a large role to Smoot-Hawley as a contributor to the Great Depression. And the intuition there is that the size of the output decline was just so large that there's little additional room for trade policy. And there are also interesting parallels to the present. So like in this more recent trade war, Smoot-Hawley was initiated by the US. It was provoked by concerns over fairness of trade. It followed a period of sustained economic expansion for the US, and it also triggered targeted responses by affected countries. Of course, there's a lot of research that's already been done on Smoot-Hawley, and there's a large literature on sort of the general impact of tariffs and in some cases other trade barriers on trade in the 1930s. For reasons of time, I'll skip the summary here, but what is important to note is that to our knowledge, Smoot-Hawley has not been analyzed systematically as a trade war. And this is sort of where we see the contribution of this paper. We provide an explicit empirical analysis of the trade war from an international perspective, asking who retaliated and what the effects of this retaliation were. And crucial for our analysis here is the definition of a trade war and to separate a trade war from sort of a general rise in protectionism. So we rely on Conybeare's definition, who defines a trade war as a category of intense international conflict where states interact, bargain, and retaliate primarily over economic objectives directly related to the traded goods or service sectors of their economies, and where the means used are restrictions on the free flow of goods and services. And what's key here for us is timely retaliation, and we make use of this to identify the participants of the trade war. We bring high frequency data of global bilateral trade flows in the 1920s and 30s to this question to identify the effects associated with the trade war and separate it from this general rise in protectionism. We also use product level data on US exports at the quarterly level from 1926 to 32 and look for specific targeting of US exports by trade partners on specific trade categories. And then lastly, we offer a welfare analysis of all participants in this trade war to measure the economic cost of the trade war. And because time is short, let me just preview our findings. So US exports to countries that explicitly retaliated by raising tariffs declined by an additional 28 to 33%. US exports to countries that protested Smoot-Hawley also fell proportionately more than US exports to countries that didn't respond, namely by about 15 to 22%. And there's narrative evidence that these countries might have resorted to non-tariff barriers such as quotas and boycotts. Retaliators and protesters appear to have been strategic in that they targeted key US exports. So top 10 US export categories to responders fell disproportionately by about a third. And we also see targeting of differentiated consumer goods like American automobiles. And in terms of welfare, we find that Smoot-Hawley reduced welfare from trade by about 17% for the retaliators through the end of 1931. So without going too much into the historical detail, I just want to highlight some key points because they're important for our empirical approach. So during the negotiations for Smoot-Hawley, the US Senate passes a resolution requiring the US State Department to submit all formal complaints of countries that protested the proposed tariff increases to the US Senate Finance Committee. And countries in these complaints specifically state what their concerns are and also which actions they're threatening to use in response to Smoot-Hawley. And US senators try to dismiss this, saying that trade policy is a domestic issue and foreign countries don't have a right to interfere. But we use these records to identify the set of countries that protest the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Despite these protests, though, Smoot-Hawley is passed and signed by President Hoover on June 17, 1930, comes into effect the following day, and it was rather far-reaching. So over 3,000 dutiable items in the tariff code, there were 890 increases in tariffs, 230 decreases, and the average tariff rate rises from roughly 35 to 41%, with very differential effect on different product categories. Foreign countries respond to this by increasing tariffs on US goods, and this is recognized by contemporaries. So for example, the League of Nations states that the Hawley-Smoot tariff in the United States was the signal of an outburst of tariff-making activity in other countries, partly at least by way of reprisals. Extensive increases in duty were made almost immediately by Canada, Cuba, Mexico, France, Italy, and Spain. There are other examples. So Canada, for example, raises duties twice in 1930. We see the formation of new political parties in opposition to US exports. And we identify 10 countries that retaliate by raising tariffs. And there are over 40 countries that file these formal complaints protesting the Smoot-Hawley tariff with the US State Department. And we conclude that this retaliation directed at the US fulfills the definition of a trade war. So this next slide shows a list of countries that retaliated and protested the tariff. So retaliators we define as the countries that raised tariffs in response to Smoot-Hawley, and we identify those through contemporary sources. And protesters are the countries that did file those reports with the US State Department. There's an overlap between those two groups. So most countries that retaliate also protest. In the later parts of the paper, we call the group of countries that protest, but then does not follow through with tariff retaliation as threateners, right? So they protest, but then we don't see them immediately increasing tariffs. And then we define the joint set of retaliators and protesters as responders. A quick look at US trade statistics immediately preceding Smoot-Hawley shows that the 10 countries that were the top 10 US export destinations all protested or retaliated. And looking at the top 10 source countries for US imports, 8 out of 10 of those protest or retaliate. So bold countries here are the ones that retaliated, italics the petitioned, and then both the ones that petitioned and retaliated. So to investigate this trade war, we bring a new panel data set consisting of bilateral imports that spans 99 countries, 59 sovereign. It's quarterly with some gaps, but from 1925 to 1938. It comprises over 108,000 trade observations, and it's generated from national level trade statistics. And to generate the complete data set, we sort of follow standard classification of the colonies. We construct a trade flow variable that's based on import flows, but we substitute with exports when import flows were too small or missing. And then we adjust trade flows to 0 if they're less than a threshold of $1,000. Just a brief look at the raw data. It essentially tells a story that we want to emphasize, namely that countries that we classify as retaliators or protesters reduce their imports from the US, so that US exports to these retaliators and protesters fall, while we do not see a corresponding effect for US exports to countries that didn't respond. And what this graph also nicely highlights is that the majority of US export destination countries does respond in some form. So we use a gravity model to assess how trade flows were influenced by this trade war. It's theoretically grounded, and we rely on time-varying pair-specific indicator variables to measure who retaliates and who sort of responds to Smoot-Hawley. So US country X observations take the value of 1 in the quarter that country X implements a retaliatory tariff or threatens to implement a tariff, and then it stays on in the months thereafter. We include exporter time, importer time, and pair fixed effects to allow us to control for a long list of potential confounders that are either country specific or global. And this implies that the estimated effects measure changes over time in bilateral imports for a given pair of countries. So identification here comes from pair-specific time-variant changes in trade policy, like country X implementing retaliatory measures. And our baseline regression shows the effects of retaliation and protest based on this previous classification. And just to reiterate, this is sort of what separates our work from previous work that has examined interwar trade flows and has focused sort of on general rise of protectionism. So we run a standard gravity model both for retaliators and threateners, and then for responders, sort of the joint set of retaliators and threateners. So the dependent variable is the log of country trace imports from country I in quarter T. And then we look at for the effect of retaliator, threatener, and responder. And we include a number of controls, such as the Sterling block, imperial preference, the Anglo-Irish trade war, the Reichsmark block, gold block, reciprocal trade agreements, and a crisis dummy. So let me just show you the results. The first two columns here both include the dummies for responders, so this combined set of retaliators and protesters. And then in columns 3 and 4, you see retaliators and threateners broken out. And you see that the coefficient on responder is negative and statistically significant, showing that exports from the US to those countries were on average 18 to 25% lower. And when we look at retaliation, retaliation reduced US exports by about 28 to 33%, and protesting reduced US exports by 15 to 22%. Just quickly, those results are robust to a number of robustness checks. So we looked at sovereign countries specifically. We excluded individual retaliators one at a time to make sure that not one country is driving those results. We also jointly excluded Uruguay and Argentina because they both leave the gold standard in 1929. None of these have an effect on our results, and our results are also robust to grouping retaliators into different categories. So if we break out the imperial preference countries, the gold block, and then the rest, we see significant effects for all three groups, and we find the largest effect for the imperial preference countries. So in this next section, we look at strategic responses. So the idea here is that targeting another country's products in a trade war is often done with strategic intentions. So in 2017-18, for example, we saw that China was strategic in retaliating against US by raising tariffs on specific products. This is especially important here since in the 1930s, overt discrimination using tariffs was difficult. So given a country's most favored nations obligations, it was sort of hard to impose retaliatory tariffs, but the alternative was to raise tariffs or impose non-tariff barriers disproportionately on key US exports. And there's narrative evidence that countries did engage in that. So Czechoslovakia, for example, uses auto quotas that bind for the US. France changes its auto tariffs from value to weight and thereby targeting US automobiles who tended to be heavier than European counterparts. So to look at these strategic interactions, we construct a new panel data set of close to 28,000 observations for 104 product categories that looks at US exports to 59 trade partners from 1926 to 1932. And we identified the top 10 exports from the US to each country or colony in our data set as reported by the US Department of Commerce. Based on those historical accounts, we also examine whether responders especially targeted American-made automobiles because they were a fast-growing and important US export category. And especially automobiles receive a lot of attention here since they were differentiated products, they were easily identifiable. Chrysler, Ford, General Motors were very visible American brands. And moreover, they were consumer rather than producer goods. So restricting their supply didn't have an effect on domestic industries. So we again run a gravity model here, now focusing on US exports. The dependent variable is exports of good K to country J in period T. And we have a dummy variable for top 10. So whether in 1928, good K was among the top 10 US exports to country J. And then we include the same responder, retaliator, and threatener dummies as we had identified them before. And then we include product time, and country product fixed effects. So as a result, the identifying variation here is in US exports at the product trade partner time level. And we find that the most important US exports to countries that responded to Smoot-Hawley were in fact disproportionately affected. So on average, chief US exports to retaliators fell by an additional 33%. 20% for threateners, and aggregating retaliators and threateners, we see an effect on the responders of about 22%. And if we signal out the automobile exports by adding sort of a triple interaction where we interact top 10 product category with automobiles and other vehicles and retaliator, threatener, and responder, we also see that retaliators reduce their automobile imports from the US by an additional 46%. And this effect is also statistically significant in specifications where we look at the threateners and the responder dummies, as you can see in the table. Okay, I think I have 2 minutes left, so let me briefly say something about welfare and then conclude. So in this last section, we measure welfare effects of the trade war on all participants. The idea here is that the effect of the tariff on welfare might be ambiguous, right? On the one hand, we think that tariff raises revenue and protects domestic industries, but then if we get the effect of the trade war and the retaliation, we expect this to diminish or eliminate any positive effects of the tariff. So we follow Arcolakis, Costignon, and Rodriguez-Clare, and also Felbermeyer, Young, and Lodge. And we estimate welfare as a function of the domestic trade share and the elasticity of trade, taking into account tariffs using the following formula. We, using data from JAX, we find that the trade elasticity for the interwar period is about minus 4.76, and that's in the range of those surveyed in the literature. And we can use the tariff multiplier, and we see that according to Felbermeyer, Young, and Lark, it does not require information on bilateral tariffs or bilateral trade flows. So we compute that as a share of the aggregate tariff revenue in aggregate income. Since this equation from the previous slide calculates welfare changes relative to autarky, we use it to calculate the welfare gains from trade in 1929, 1930, and 1931, and then we difference between those periods to estimate the effects of Smoot-Hawley. So for retaliators, we find that welfare declined by 0.3 percentage points between 29 and 30. So that corresponds to about an 8% reduction in total welfare gains from trade. And between 1929 and 1931, we find a 0.6 percentage points or about 17% reduction in the total welfare gains from trade. For threateners, the welfare effects are small but positive, and for the US, they're even smaller and of mixed signs. And we think this has something to do with the fact that, of course, in this context of retaliation, these are not optimal tariffs, especially the tariffs that are imposed by the retaliating countries. To conclude, so historical accounts show that countries both threatened to retaliate and then actually retaliated in response to Smoot-Hawley. By focusing on the imports of strategic responders, we identify the effects of the trade war. So retaliation reduced US exports by 22 to 33%, depending on specification. And countries that, in addition to the countries that retaliated with tariff, we also see that countries that protested see an effect, and narrative evidence suggests that here the use of non-tariff barriers and boycotts comes into play. Retaliators and protesters have been appear to have been strategic in that they targeted key US imports. So we see an effect on the top 10 imports and also on American automobiles, and conventional measures of welfare gains, even though they're small here, suggest that Smoot-Hawley actually reduced welfare from trade by about 17% for the retaliators. With that, we conclude with sort of a cautionary tale for more recent trade policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks for the lovely presentation. So I invite the audience and the assembled panelists to ask questions. There's already the first one. Guillaume Dodin, thank you for the interesting presentation. How do you interpret the decrease in US exports to the threateners, who did not increase trade barriers, if you understood correctly, compared to the non-responders?
Yeah, so that was something that initially sort of surprised us, correct? That we're seeing this effect not just on the countries that we do identify as actually raising tariffs, but also on the threateners. And we really think, and the narrative evidence supports that, that this has something to do with sort of non-tariff barriers and boycotts and other measures that countries took.
Thank you. Two questions of mine. So when you were doing your welfare analysis, right? So you did this at the aggregate country level. But can you say, or do you think you have data to say whether the retaliators strategically chose which exports from the US to target, such as to minimize their own welfare loss? You know, thinking of supply chains, you know, did they spare key capital goods that they imported from the US and decided to just go after Iowa wheat or something like that? That's the first question. And then the second, so you started by saying that Congress took note and decided to ignore the protests from, you know, the rest of the world. But is that really the case? Because, you know, at least in the Senate, it took a while for them to trash out the actual new tariff schedule. Is there possible to get some, again, some traction, some evidence on whether implicitly some senator from some states decided, you know, that actually we're not going to do this because we depend too much on trade with. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give you my quick response, but then I'll invite my co-authors to chime in if they would like to add something. So on the welfare, I mean, we do know that responses were strategic in terms of these sort of visible consumer goods, right, like automobiles. And we can't identify, or we can't really see, so you find narrative evidence that countries were thinking about products that were hard to substitute from other sources, right? So if you look at the narrative evidence, you do see that. We can't really disentangle, I mean, that would sort of require us to look sort of in more detail at the responders, sort of what the domestic structure of these economies, to what extent that sort of mitigated or encouraged that strategic response. And I've blanked on the second question. I'll hand it over to Chris, but I'll come back.
I think the second question was whether there were particular legislators in the United States who were taking a thinking strategically about this possible responses of other countries. And I think really the way I would think about it is this it's a sequence of events where when the US was thinking of passing Smoot-Hawley, it was largely for domestic reasons. And so we're kind of taking that as a given. And then the responses really come after that. So what Kirsten didn't have time to discuss was that there's this long buildup of, you know, kind of 10 years of attempts to protect agriculture. And it's all in response to kind of the change in agricultural prices after World War I, and earlier tariff activity in the US really didn't address agriculture. And so Hoover comes in with an agenda to try to do this. But even before Hoover can get inaugurated, Congress is already moving, and they open up the entire US trade docket and then begin to adjust tariffs on every good, not just agriculture. So it's really driven by domestic politics. And, you know, the converse of this, which is a super interesting question you're raising, is what Kirsten was alluding to. It would be a wonderful extension, maybe for a team of graduate students to write a paper, if we could get into the each individual country that does retaliate, what were the domestic motivations of the responses in those countries? And, you know, since we're the first kind of document just the general effects of this trade war, we decided that's for future research rather than for this paper.
Which is great. This has been a very productive session. 2 big research agendas inaugurated already, so keep track. The other thing I missed is market power, right? So strategic trade policy, Brander and all, maybe that's too old. But wouldn't the scale of these tariffs vary with the perceived market power from the US? You know, you mentioned automobiles, right? That I guess that would be the equivalent of Boeing versus Airbus of today, right? Can you say something about that?
Chris, do you want to, or?
I think I don't have. The answer is we haven't really thought about that in detail. What struck us as interesting about automobiles and related parts was that they are differentiated final goods. And one of the things that especially Kevin raised when we were working on this project is we're working in a world in which MFN actually does exist. And so the question then becomes, how do you strategically retaliate given a framework where there is a rule book where countries are supposed to be treating each other equally? And what is very interesting is that this is a way to do it, right? You can kind of say, well, let's target a particular good from the US that's important, right? So this is a little bit getting at what you're talking about. Automobiles were a fast-growing sector in the US economy. We have to work, a country that's retaliating has to work within the MFN, so they target automobiles in part because they know it's primarily going to hit the US. And so that's kind of their equivalent of the, if we were thinking in the modern context and being an anachronistic, it's like, China's targeted response to wheat in, or corn in Iowa, I should say, to hit Trump, where voters might actually, vote with their pocketbooks, in the recent presidential election here.
And we do see, just to add to that, that for other products, so if we look at the US export data and we look at what are other sort of big product categories, you do see that there is sort of a strategic element in, so for example, petroleum exports are also a relatively large category, but countries are not targeting those because they can't find easy substitutes and they're more dependent on the US trade there, right? And I think the other thing that sort of, I think makes the automobiles stand out is that they're so easily identifiable. Right. And I mean, you see like Italian car makers are taking out huge ads in the Italian papers, sort of saying like, shame people that drive American automobiles. Right. So there is sort of this really visible aspect to it, which makes it easy to single out those products.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Otherwise, everyone is just amusing me, so I can ask another one, right? So
John had a question.
John, go ahead, John.
Sorry, but I can't raise a hand on my version of Zoom.
Yes, you can. Yeah, you were seeing.
I raised my, I did that.
Yeah.
So I actually read this paper this spring with my graduate students, and I found it very interesting. And I like it. It's a domestic story, and the details of that are quite interesting. But when I got to the bottom line of the paper, I thought, okay, I really haven't changed any of my views about Smoot-Hawley and why this happened and that its effects were small. You talk about 17% of the welfare gains from trade, and then I'm going to multiply that by something, and I'm going to come up with something that doesn't explain the Great Depression. And that really didn't come out in the presentation very strongly, or basically you guys kind of come up with the same effect in the aggregate, but the story is really not that. It's about the details, which I think are fascinating. But this isn't changing our perspective on Smoot-Hawley and its role in the Depression.
From the,
I think.
Can I say
something? You want to take that?
No, Kevin wants to.
Well, just, I think that, I agree. The welfare effects are small. That's partly an artifact of just the method that's used. These Archilakas et al. Methods, they always produce small numbers, and some people hate them for that reason. And but I think there's a value to showing that the trade flow impacts are big. Big trade flow impacts can translate into then small welfare effects because things are substitutable with each other and all that kind of jazz. But there is a kind of a view in the literature that trade policies didn't even affect trade flows very much during this period, because the trade flows are basically being driven by income declines and output declines and so on. And that, this is saying that these policies are really dramatically changing the direction of trade patterns. So that's not welfare, but it's interesting in itself, I think, especially in the context of the interwar period, where these distortions of international trade are feeding into politics and things. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. And I think we have to leave it at that. Thanks to the presenters and the audience and the speakers and everything. This would be the moment when we would be giving you instructions on how to reach the conference dinner site. It's a lovely late afternoon today. We'd have a great time dining by the lake. Unfortunately, We can't do it this time, but as announced yesterday, we hope to bring the conference back to Geneva in 2 years, and we hope to see you all then. But until now, I hope you enjoy your rest of mornings, afternoons, or evenings the best you can, and we'll see ourselves again tomorrow at 2 p.m. London time. Till then, have a good one.